Okay. Are we all ready? So we'll now call this meeting to order. It is our December 10 regular school board meeting. We're going to start at, I guess, 10 after 7. So we'll start with a moment of silence, please. Now, if the members will rise to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So I should have said thank you to all of you. I know that not everybody came for the reception, but it's important for us to recognize our Garrett. Thank you for being with us. And the first item is just the agenda. Do we have any revisions?
I'd like to pull the, from the consent agenda, the field trip item, number 4, and the Tally Street Upper Elementary closeout, number 5, to the action agenda.
Okay, so that'll be done. Any other changes? Okay. Next, we have a number of sets of minutes to approve. We have the minutes from the October 1st meeting, the October 24th work session, and the November 12th regular meeting. Do we have any changes to the minutes from those meetings?
No.
So they'll be approved as presented. And next, that brings us to our spotlight, which is Decatur High School. David.
Wes, are you leading it? All right.
Good evening, y'all. I'm Wes Hatfield, the interim principal at Decatur High School. I'm joined this evening by Dwayne Spruill, our Career Academy Director, Cheryl Namis and Deborah Ledoux, our IB coordinators and instructional coaches, and Kim Jones, who is our head counselor. So as we were thinking about what to come to you with this evening, a conversation that we've started at the high school that has been born of conversations with parents, with students, actually with some board members, with Dr. Duty, really around where do our kids go after they leave Decatur High School? What post-secondary choices do they make? And so what we're going to spotlight for you this evening is a project that we have in progress. I'm going to describe it to you in the amount of time that a spotlight is afforded. So just know this will be a little bit of bell-to-bell instruction. I'll make sure that I am thorough, but also leave us some time for Q&A. So when we look at the problem that we're trying to solve, we know that it is critical, especially as students are reaching the midpoint of high school, for students to be able to make good choices about the courses they take in 11th and 12th grade. There are multiple avenues available to our students, and we want to make sure that they are prepared for and have appropriate access to the post-secondary options that they desire. So our goal is to create a database resource for DHS adults to use in advising students and their families, and to use that resource to positively impact the decision-making process for those families. So what we did to start this work and what we have done to begin this work is we have collaboratively looked at and created a set of post-secondary categories that our students choose to participate in, that they choose to move on to when they leave Decatur High School. The categories that we started with are listed in the top 5 bullet points. Some things that you will not see listed here. You will not see 2-year colleges listed here yet. You also do not see a category for students who chose not to go to college yet. I say yet very intentionally. We are at the start of collecting this data, and those are 2 places where our data sets are pretty incomplete, and so we address some of those needs in our action steps. Essentially what we've done for Where Do Kids Go is we've grouped these by the final transcript request that kids make of us. So to some extent, this is self-report data. If a student asks that their final transcript be sent to Morehouse, we are making the assumption that that student is going to Morehouse. They had a plan to go, they asked for their final transcript to be sent there. So that is an assumption that we are making. We also selected some preliminary data points to use for each student. Their weighted GPA, we chose that because many colleges choose some kind of a weighted GPA as a way of making decisions about students. It's not necessarily the way that we weight, but we do some weighting, and that weighting is based on college level courses that students take. SAT is in there right now. We will be adding ACT. We've had some technical challenges with that, but that'll be a part of our ongoing work. The number of college level courses that a student has completed and the programs at Decatur High School that they have participated in. The diploma program, the career program, whether they participated in a career pathway, and whether they participated in work-based learning. Again, what we're attempting to do here is say, this is what the range of students looks like that chose these options post-secondarily. What you do not see listed here again yet is information about race and gender for a couple of reasons. Number one, we want to be really careful when presenting that data that we are not inadvertently identifying specific students. So for example, if in the highly selective university category, we have had a small number of Hispanic students attend a university like that, or a small number of Black students attend a university like that. Any data that we put up that is disaggregated might inadvertently identify specific students. We also want to make sure that when we present this data set with race included, that we are thorough in including all student backgrounds, all student races appropriately. So what we have created is a set of profiles for colleges and universities. Again, the goal being to effectively communicate with our families, to be able to show them this is what kids who have gone to these kinds of schools have done at Decatur High School, so that you can make the best decisions for yourself, and ultimately so that we can look at how all students are accessing our programs and make decisions about whether those programs are working for all students. So I'm going to flip through these relatively quickly. This is our 4-year Georgia University profile. We did choose to include both the average, median, and mode of college level courses because some interesting trends come out when we look at that. So, and then what you see at the bottom is percent completing one or more of, or one of these programs. There is some overlap, career program and work-based learning. There's some overlap in students who complete those and career paths as well. Highly selective Georgia universities, Georgia Tech, Emory, University of Georgia. As you know, Georgia Tech and Georgia over the course of the last 10, 15 years have become more and more selective. These are highly selective non-Georgia schools. These are historically Black colleges and universities. And nearby state schools, and I should point out for the purposes of this, these are nearby state schools. USC is the University of South Carolina. Or as people around here would say, the real USC. You will get conflicting information. I have all the action steps printed out. Do you mind grabbing them? Thank you. So this is where we are in terms of creating these university profiles thus far, to use them both as a communication tool with families, but then to also think about how are our programs working for all of our students. So we have a set of action steps that we've come up with that we want to implement. This is a summary of those action steps. Dr. Jones is handing you more detailed information about the why behind these action steps and how we are moving forward to make sure that our families and students are as well informed and that they understand the nuance of the decisions that they're making, and that they understand how the programs at Decatur High School can support them in reaching their post-secondary goals. The first action step for the class of 2020, so our current seniors, One thing that a gap that we want to fill in is making sure that we know exactly where every kid is going next, what their plan is for what they're doing next year. Our counselors work with all of our students to talk about post-secondary planning, but for those students that have not identified, hey, this is where you need to send my transcript to, this is where I'm going, this is what I'm doing next, we want to have those individual conversations, both to collect information from kids and help them with those next steps in their planning. We want to compile high school and post-secondary info specifically for our non-white students for each graduating class for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, we want to know how programs at Decatur High School, coursework, IB programs, dual enrollment, work-based learning, all of these things are working for our non-white students. So that we can do a better job of explaining those offerings to kids and do a better job of adjusting the offerings that we do have to make sure that all students feel confident and comfortable and prepared to participate in those offerings. One thing that we do comprehensively for our rising 10th graders that we want to extend further is we want to hold individual conferences with students to increase the number of underrepresented students in our college level courses. One thing, for example, that we do right now, many students take advanced placement U.S. history in the 10th grade. Students request their courses in the fall, and then we follow up with kids who we think would be a good fit for AP U.S. history, who would do well in the course, and our counselors follow up with all of the students who didn't request it based on grades, MAP scores, things like that would be a good fit. We want to expand that and actually do that more before we do the course request process instead of after we've completed the course request process. We also want to be able to disaggregate our student data so that we can give that to families in our small group conferences so that they can really clearly see how participation in different kinds of academic pathways and programs supports them in whatever their post-secondary goals are. Number 5 is pretty self-explanatory. We're working with research and analytics to make sure that SAT and ACT data are very easily pulled for us. That should not be a barrier to doing this kind of work, and we are working to eliminate that barrier. Number 6, we have to do a better job of collecting post-secondary data from students who do not go to college. That is currently a gap in our information, and we have to do a better job of figuring out where kids are going and whether they are choosing to not go to college to meet goals that they set for themselves in high school, or whether they're not going to college and didn't have a plan that they were executing post-secondarily. And then number 7, this is the budgeting time of year, and we're considering how we can increase the size of our counseling department as we continue to grow, because as you know from all the enrollment reports, Decatur High School is still growing. Other schools are not in a growth phase anymore. Decatur High School is still very much in a growth phase, and so we're thinking about how to manage that growth and continue to provide excellent service, counseling services to our kids as our student population grows. So with that, we will take your questions.
Well, thank you for this work, Mr. Hatfield. I just have a question or maybe a suggestion in terms of how the HBCUs, because not all HBCUs are created the same. And so,
Go ahead, please finish. And then
so I know Spelman is a highly selective school. Mm-hmm. And so not every applicant who may be accepted to say, not every young lady who applies to Fort Valley might be accepted at Spelman. And so as you all are creating these school profiles and making suggestions, I wouldn't want a student who may not have the GPA and the scores thinking she can go to Spelman because she's thinking that, this is HBCU. And so, and then there's, we got the HBCU state schools, which I wish more students would consider, because most of the time, it is financially helpful.
Yes, ma'am.
And so I wish more students would consider the HBCU state schools.
So, Sproul, if you want to.
So that's a good question. That's something we debated always to the point where I sent a message to the Dillard University, which is HBCU, the president, and asked him how to term it, because we had the term selective and elite. And then I got into the whole Black Ivy thing, which I don't want to go into right now with you all. But what I came back to when we looked at the list, me and Cheryl talked. I was out of town. We talked a couple of times. They had started identifying kids. Like, it would perhaps identify your kids, if your own children, if we did that. So after those recommendations, what we decided was to keep the list compiled as one, but also acknowledge that we know that there's a certain type of kid that are going to Howard, Hampton, and Tuskegee. And when you look at those kids, we can all look at the kids and say, those are upper middle class kids, and their parents can afford to pay some sort of measurable tuition. And so we kept them together, but for our own purposes, we do have them separated out based on kind of what you just said, as far as those schools that are more selective, or the way I explained it to my peers was that it's not so much as who they accept in all the time, but it's kind of like what's the product on the back end, where there are some that are a little more selective, but then there are many HBCUs that are just open access. If you want to come, we'll take you where you are and develop you from there to wherever you want to get to.
Thank you.
So we very much appreciate that feedback, and as you can see, that's an ongoing conversation, because we want to make sure ultimately that whatever we put in front of kids and families is helping them make the best possible decisions. So thank you for sharing that.
I think it's great work that you're giving a roadmap not only to the kids but to the families, because if it's their first child going to college, or if they've never been to college themselves, it can be extremely overwhelming. And even now, as they enter high school, just the first choice is like, what do I do? Which elective should I take? Is there one that's better than another? And how to make those decisions is so important to get the guidance. And I appreciate that you recognize that not every child is going to go to a four-year college, but that it's really important for the child to have a plan what to do after graduation, so that each graduate can make a contribution to our society and our community. So I appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Well, I know that this is needed because I've had parents come and say, why isn't this information available? And so I think this fills a need, so thank you for doing that. As I was looking at it, I had a concern. I mean, part of it is just sort of the pit of my stomach. I get back into this, all the anxiety of trying to get yourself into college, and I started to feel a little bit sick. But one question that it brought up with me is that because it's so focused on the numbers, and and I wondered if at a minimum we couldn't fill out the profiles so that it's not just about the coursework and the GPA and the SAT. It's also about your leadership profile and your extracurriculars, and I think that has a lot to do with who actually lands in the various schools. So that was one comment. It sounds like you understand it.
Yeah.
The other is, and it sounds like you intend to address it, but the career tech pathway needs to be represented as well, and not just the college. But it sounds like that's intended.
That our intention is to round out all of these profiles to be able to give kids information about all possible pathways after graduation.
Good.
Would anybody over to my right like to say?
Well, I just want to say to your point about the hysteria.
Can you come up
around
here,
college
Cheryl?
admissions. Sorry. Thank you. So what you just brought up, the sort of anxiety around college admissions, is a very real thing. And having worked at Renfro for 7 years, it starts when kids are 11. Mm-hmm. Like, I've seen it from the very start. And so part of this is that I think at Decatur High School and in this community, there's this emphasis on the things that are at the top. And UGA and Tech have become up there. It's sort of all this, what does it take to get into certain kinds of schools? And so I think that part of the effort here is to show the wide range of possibilities for kids and the things that can happen for them as a result of participating. So I think that is the goal. And so our goal for this data set is to start including things like participation in sports, participations in other kinds of extracurriculars, to show just sort of the range of things that kids might want to participate in that will impact their outcomes positively.
As you do it, so one concern of mine, and maybe it's a peeve or maybe it's a concern, but I think it's very unhealthy that people have this sense that in order to get into X school, to my preferred school, I'm going to have found a small state or principality or something like that. And so there's this anxiety that goes from the grades to the standardized tests to now all of a sudden, even, when I'm playing football or whatever, I have to be, all district or whatever.
Right.
And that's a concern. It's especially, I think, pernicious when it leads people to just sign up for a bunch of stuff. And so they're not even getting quality participation. They're you're just going through the motions. And so somehow if you can communicate it about quality participation and quality activities, it actually causes people to grow,
Yes.
which is a challenge because you're making a list of data points.
Yeah.
And so you have to find out how not to feed the anxiety while at the same time providing the information that people need.
Yeah, I hear you. So actually, one of the reasons we started on this data set is because we have parents saying to us, it's all so much information. Like, how can I, and so the caution is when you put data in front of people, sometimes it has the opposite effect.
Right,
It makes them think, oh, well, now I see what I have to do.
right.
And so it's a fine line, and we've talked to some parents, and I think we're going to be careful about how we roll this out. I think originally, or now our intention is to use it in sort of small settings and not make it some sort of widely published thing, but it just gives us a database tool, so it's not always about our individual opinions, but more about something that people can look at tangibly and kind of find themselves there.
And probably the main thing is to counsel people through it
Exactly.
so that you're talking to
Yeah.
them.
And Kim will tell you our standard counseling to students is pick 2 things you're passionate about,
Yeah.
not a laundry list.
Our spiel to families, because it's the honest to goodness truth, is that colleges are looking for a well-rounded freshman class. So they don't want the football player who can also write code and run the journalism paper, but they want a football player and a coder and a journalism student within that 300 or 3,000 people that they're going to invite for admission. So we tell students, do a thing and become an officer or a leader. Don't try to do everything.
Right.
We just have to put that on repeat, rinse and repeat.
Good.
Thank you.
And I think another piece of that, just real quick, is the importance of including the voice of graduates and the student voice in what we choose to do. How many of us know about the honors program at the University of South Carolina and the quality of that program? Well, we've had some kids actually, go to USC and be in that honors program. And, just having kids come back and share experiences and finding a way to do that can also be important, valuable.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
I can't tell if Garrett has a question.
Sorry.
I saw the microphone moving, so.
That's the signal.
Thank you. I think this focus on that transition point between high school and college and career is incredibly important. And, it's hard because you do everything you can to prepare and then they're gone. But trying to reach beyond and use that as a feedback loop to see what we could do better is very important. I appreciate you putting the effort into this. I did want to ask, I might have missed it, are we looking at students who go into the armed services?
Yes, absolutely.
Are we looking at students whose parents or guardians might not have had the college experience and giving them the additional supports because those sheaves of forms and FAFSAs and financial aid packets and stuff can convince you to go a different path? It's overwhelming. So are there supports in place for students who have, some students are doing it on their own, and I don't know how they can do that.
Come back to the mic. I should start.
We are currently reviving our college advocate program. And what that is, we're actually changing the name to post-secondary process navigation supports. We got to find some kind of way to make that cute, but that's what it is. Whatever your post-secondary plan is, having individuals with expertise or experience in those areas working with families to help you complete the FAFSA, to help you get in contact with college admissions, with career individuals, with apprenticeship programs and things of that nature, to make sure we make those connections.
I really appreciate you changing that from, and it echoes what Lewis was saying, from college to post-secondary, because
Absolutely.
we all have known somebody or somebodies who've done the 4-year college thing, gotten their degree, hung it on the wall, and then did something entirely different. So, yeah, the college and career thing was one of the last things. And then I guess financial aid and scholarships for those students who need that. What type of supports are in place or are being developed? And does that go into the same post-secondary planning?
Right, so we'll have those individuals assisting the counseling department, assisting students. And we also currently have once per semester FAFSA individuals from the Georgia Student Finance Commission and financial aid officers from colleges coming in and helping students and families, parents mainly, because that's who does the FAFSA, helping the parents complete their FAFSA.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you all.
Appreciate it.
Okay, we have two
That brings-
public comment
All
time.
right. Now, I need to prepare a script, and I haven't done it, so I'm going to do this off the top of my head. And this is not directed at our public commenters. I'm going to start doing this before every meeting. But I'd ask you to, we limit our public comment to 3 minutes per speaker. And it's a time to address the board about basically board business, which you can think of as matters of policy that the board acts on. It's not a place to air specific grievances about specific employees or specific issues that would be better resolved in other forums. And so if you start venturing in that territory, from where we sit, it's hard for us to tell where you're going to go. So please don't be offended if I raise up a hand and ask you to pause while we figure out if this is appropriate for board comment or not. And if I do that, I'll ask you please not to be offended, but just to take a breath and we'll figure it out. There's some other rules. The rules are posted at the back, but for now I think that'll do. And so our first commenter, and one rule also is that if you'd please, when you come to address the board, if you'd tell us who you are and obviously your name, but also your connection to the district, just so that we can understand how to put your comments in context. So the first is Mamie Grodzen. Marnie Grodzen, pardon me.
In his defense, it does look like an M right there, so.
My name's Marnie Grodzen. I am a community member. I have a son who's a graduate of the high school last year and an 8th grade daughter. I stand humbly in front of you taking the lessons that I tell my kids they get 3 strikes when they leave something at home. I left a change of clothes at my house and didn't have time to run home. I appreciate this time. A couple things have come up in my mind to share in my short period of time being up here. My intention was to come up here, bless you, and say thank you for the work that has been put into the Student Center going back several years. It has been great. Let me back up. So I am a parent, I'm a community social worker, and wear a variety of hats in town, primarily working with youth in different capacities. So I want to give my appreciation for that. Piggybacking on what was already said, I also want to give my appreciation how the orientation process for upcoming freshmen has gotten better and better, and we just recently witnessed that in our house. We heard Dr. Jones' voice and Wes's voice on a PowerPoint explaining the process, which is a big improvement from years past and helps ease the anxiety of students and families. Speaking of anxiety, yes, that is real, not just in speaking of the college process, but a variety of things that are going on in our community, which then brings me back to my gratefulness for the Student Center. The main point of me coming up here is, in my opinion, it's taken a long time to get the configuration of the Student Center as to what it needs to be to work to capacity. And I know that things are being done for that. I believe there's been some approval. I tried to stay at the last board meeting until you guys got to budgets, but it was like such a long time. And I tried to look to find the information and I couldn't. So I'm just putting it out in the open that, I would like to see that go as quickly as possible. We're hindering additional things that could be done with those students in the population. And one other point to mention, and I'm going to try not to get teary-eyed. I think I got that out when you were talking. But I had planned to come for the last several weeks or so to address you. And ironically, I've had, and I'm not going to say in what capacity because it can give away maybe who these students are, but I wear 3 different hats in this community professionally, and I've had 2 students mention to me that if the student center wasn't there, that they feel like they may not be here. And that just tells the story. You know, we lost Bryce last year, which was a student I worked with, and I just hate to see more and more time go on where we don't have those walls, we don't have that space for students. Thank you.
Mauli Davis.
Good evening. Mauli Davis, City of Decatur. I'm coming as a co-chair of the Beacon Hill Black Alliance. And just again, we feel like it's our responsibility to continue to sound the alarm around issues that impact our children. We really believe that there's a need for community engagement around understanding where we are with PBIS, and I know that it's been explained in this space, but we think that and we're prepared to do it again so that we can all know where we are on PBIS in each of the schools and what the plan is, and community members can have clear understanding. Also, what the plan is around closing the achievement gap. Obviously, the recent article that discussed the decline of closing the gap scores at Renfro, and we recognize that in all the other scores, it looked like they either increased or they were level, but that still appeared to be a very significant decline in that area. And what does that mean? Because it's you know, in the newspaper, it's printed, and community members don't know what does that mean, what that particular score in that decline, and then what are the factors that cause that decline. So we just, again, are here. We welcome continue to do the work collaboratively where we can get the word out, get clarity, ask questions. There remain a lot of frustrated parents and upset parents across the district around issues of equity and the achievement gap, and as well as just the way their children are being treated. So we just want to keep that at top of mind as we continue to press forward and move into 2020. Thank you.
And just so you know, Molly, the state has let us know there was an error in the formula for the middle schools, and so we're waiting to see if that impacts our score or not, and then we can share more about that once we know.
Okay, now I think we're going to jumble the agenda just a little bit to have the equity spotlight next.
I'm afraid the cake's going to wear off, and so I thought maybe we should jump to the kids. Is that okay, kids, if we jump to Glenwood right now? Okay. All right, let's do that.
And then they could have more cake.
That's right, exactly.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we had a water catastrophe a minute ago. So. Okay, well, hi, I'm Christy Beam. I'm the principal at Glenwood Elementary. And at Glenwood, we are dedicated to disrupting those practices that have led to that disproportionality here in city schools of Decatur and around the United States. Schools have long been considered a microcosm of society, and as such, the words of Justice Sotomayor speak to the urgency and importance of making immediate and impactful changes in our schools. We believe that it is imperative, in order to make significant change, that we engage our community as a whole. We have parents, staff members, and students that are focused on the critical need of changing the practices that have negatively impacted our Black students. We have several parents and staff members that have stepped up to lead this important work. First, we'd like to hear from Dr. Ibokwe Hamilton, chair of our PTA Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Dr. Hamilton.
Good evening. My name is Ashley Ibokwe Hamilton, and it is my privilege to serve as chair of the Glenwood Elementary PTA newly formed Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. My family and I are new to City of Decatur as of this past summer, and my oldest daughter is a kindergartner at Glenwood. We are really thrilled to be here at Glenwood and in our new community. And you might be wondering how a person who's new to the city and new to the school became the chair. But for me, it was pretty simple. When I attended the first PTA meeting of the year and I learned about the committee, I immediately got so excited. I think my husband was next to me and I was like, we have to be a part of this. We are an American family who is of African descent, and we also, our kindergarten daughter has Down syndrome and special needs. So it was really the fabric of my family that motivated me to want to be all in when I heard about this committee. It does in a way sadden me that such a committee is needed, but I truly realize its importance. So I think all of us at some point in our lives have probably inadvertently, unintentionally excluded people with our words, with our actions, and not even trying to be malicious. And most of us have done that. But I also know that sometimes things are done intentionally. And so I think my belief is that if we just all treated each other how we would want to be treated, then that would probably solve most of society's issues. But that's idealistic, and that's not the way of the world that we live in. So I think that it's very important that we learn to meet people where they are and that we promote change that will be beneficial to everyone. So diversity, equity, and inclusion have always been important to me for as long as I can remember being able to conceptualize these topics. I'm a physician by profession, and I chose the field of family medicine and specifically primary care very early on in my education after learning about the disparities that exist in health and healthcare in this country amongst different groups, especially those that affect communities of color. And so right now I'm actually working at a federally qualified health center serving patients who are medically underserved, underinsured, uninsured, because they do also need and deserve equal access to high quality health care. So similarly, when we were researching moving to City of Decatur and City Schools of Decatur as a potential new home, we heard and read countless stories about the educational and socioeconomic disparities that exist here in this very district. And so those things really motivated me to want to do whatever I could to help promote change in this setting as well. So to that point, I would like to share with you some information about what we call our DEI committee, because diversity, equity, and inclusion is a tongue twister and takes a long time to say, but including information about our mission and our goals and some of the work that we've started to do and have accomplished thus far. So we had our first meeting in October with 12 people in attendance, and we have met monthly since then. We had our third meeting last week, and our committee now has over 20 members from all different backgrounds. Our mission is to promote and enhance spaces where everyone is appreciated and celebrated. Diversity and inclusion are not one and the same, so many institutions are made up of a diverse population, as is Glenwood, but that does not often equate to everyone in that community feeling like they actually belong. So our DEI committee wants to do its best to change that. Our goals really fall into three main categories, and those are needs assessment, building community, and promoting inclusion. So our specific goals, number one, is hearing the voices or needs of all of our families at Glenwood Elementary School. So to that goal, we have developed a survey which will be distributed to all of our Glenwood families with the goal of learning about the experiences of the people in our school community, and so that we can help to promote changes at the school level and maybe even at a school district level where needed. Number two, we want to be intentional about modeling and promoting the building of meaningful relationships at amongst members of our diverse school community. We as a committee want to be good examples of making the effort, going the extra mile to engage with people who maybe we would not have felt comfortable with engaging with before, because real change will happen by breaking down barriers, by eliminating bias, one relationship at a time. And that sounds really cliche, but it's true. And so we are most afraid of the unknown. And so once we just get to know each other a little bit better, I think that will help to promote change. Number 3, we want to host events that foster a sense of community and show an appreciation for the diverse fabric of our school. So we are really excited. So it says multicultural night, but since the slide deck was made, we have changed the name to Glenwood Culture Night that we have coming up next month. Our theme is We Are Glenwood, and our goal is to showcase and get to know our respective cultures of our fellow Glenwood families. So we're really excited about that event. It's coming up on January the 26th. Number 4, promoting conversations in our community on the topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we have talked about having maybe a Glenwood Elementary dinner, and obviously this is inspired by the Decatur dinners that take place here. Also an event maybe similar to the Peace and Pie event that Tally has had, and I believe Winona Park has had one as well. And I actually had the pleasure of attending Tally Street's event a couple weeks back, and that was great. And number 5, we want to promote inclusion and diversity at all school events. So this might sound like a simple goal, but I think that this one is arguably the most important, because not many other things can separate a school, like having events where some people don't feel like they're included or like they really belong. And so from what I've learned about the school historically, certain groups have been very poorly represented or virtually absent from many of the events. And so our committee wants to try to identify why that is the case and then work hard to promote improvement in that area. We are also very appreciative of the efforts of the PTA board and of our school's leadership to the goals of our DEI committee. So thank you, Dr. Beam, and thank you to the PTA board for all of your support and efforts. I hope that this gave you a nice glimpse into our Glenwood DEI committee. Thank you for your time and your ears. I'm really excited about this committee and about the work that we've already started to do. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to contact me. My email address is there. And I have, in addition to my kindergarten, I have a 4-year-old and an almost 3-year-old, so we'll be at Glenwood for a while. So I'm really excited to see the progression of how things go with our work here. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ibokwe. Okay, and next we will hear from our staff member, Ms. Amelia Kopp. She is the co-chair of our school equity team.
Hello. So what I wanted to talk to you about right now is how we kicked off some of the equity work at Glenwood. We decided to focus on whiteness because we found that just by having conversations with staff, that was needed. And so on October 7th, our staff participated in a discussion focused on an article titled 10 Myths White People Believe About Racism. The article was originally intended for a faith-based community, but Dr. Banks from City Schools of Decatur graciously agreed to adapt the article to be more appropriate for a non-secular group. The facilitators for this session included Dr. Pam Epps, who is a licensed psychologist and practices in Decatur. She also goes to Oakhurst Presbyterian, which is the church that I attend. Reverend Elliot Robinson, who is a former Glenwood parent, and he also has a podcast that's called Creative Tension. If you haven't listened to it, it's worth listening to. There's a lot of history in it that is very eye-opening for many people, and I encourage you to listen to that. Also, another person who was a facilitator for this session was Charlie Kopp, who's my husband, and he also leads racism workshops at Oakhurst Presbyterian Church. And the purpose of the session was to begin a conversation about whiteness with our staff. During the session, each small group did a close read of 2 myths and wrote down their thoughts and discussed them with a small group. And after that, each group posted their thoughts around the room for others to see in a gallery walk. And finally, we closed with a big group discussion. And some takeaways we had after that discussion included a new vision of the difference between
not being racist versus becoming anti-racist, and an understanding that our impact does not always align with our intentions. After the training, we asked staff for feedback about positive experiences with past equity trainings, and overwhelmingly, the responses included time for open and honest conversations, small group work, hearing different perspectives, and grappling with issues together. The feedback we received will lead our future work with equity at Glenwood. Finally, we will hear from our Boys in Action team.
Good evening. My name is Michael Scott. Glenwood Boys in Action has been a mission to build school communities of support through strong role models who use mentoring to encourage and empower Black and brown boys. It has been an honor to have families entrust us with each of these young boys' thoughts, their hopes, and their dreams. It is my greatest honor to stand alongside them and their families in ensuring the best possible life's journey for them.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Holloman, and I'm part of Boys in Action, and being part of Boys in Action is a great thing to do for me because I've been one of these little kids before. And thinking back to my youth, I needed help. I'm a product of a single mother household, so I jumped right on it when they asked me. So I'm grateful to the DEF and the PTA at Glenwood Elementary for sponsoring the things that these gentlemen are going to speak about. So let me introduce the boys. We have Eli.
Hi, my name is Eli. Hello.
Hi, Eli.
I like that we get to hear stories and read books about inspiring people.
Awesome.
Next, we have Nazir. Eli was a second grader. He's kind of one of the leaders. We put the second graders that we have to lead because they're going to move on from Tally. And when they go to Tally, they're going to be like, hey, they came from Glenwood Boys in Action.
Mr. Hallman and Mr. Scott are cool. They both are nice, and I feel like they know me. I like that Mr. Scott is always calm, and he helped me in school.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Last, Nazir was in the first grade. Next, we have Everett.
Hello, I am Everett. We are learning to be leaders by helping others. We made helpful bags for homeless people: toothpaste, toothbrush, soap, can of food, gum, hand sanitizer, and lotion. Now we have a slideshow from our team. Mr. Holloman let us learn and make us go on field trips and do fun stuff. I like about Boys in Action that we get to learn new things and we get to go on a field trip, and when new people come in, we get to make new friends. And we went to Coca-Cola, and they had these machines when they just have to press buttons, and then their soda came out and they didn't have to pay money. And they had a really nice cafe. And then we went to Morehouse College where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. went, and we got to eat there and learn about him. The inventor of the Super Soaker, Lonnie Johnson. My favorite thing is about Boys in Action is going on field trips and doing fun things. I like that we went to Coca-Cola and we got to learn about it, and it's really cool. And I like Boys in Action a lot. The thing I like most about Boys in Action is that we get to learn about historical people. And we went on a field trip and we went to the World of Coke in Morehouse. But we didn't go to the World of Coke. We went to where they actually make Coke and they put it in the World of Coke. And we got to get our own slushies. I mixed mine with all three. And we got a tour, and there are like these bottle cap things on the top that would flip and spell Coke and stuff. And they had this like water thing that fell and spelt stuff and made pictures. And then we went to Morehouse, and their cafeteria was bigger than our bottom school floor. And I really like Mr. Holloman, Mr. Scott, because they're always supportive and kind and help us when we accidentally do something wrong.
Hi, my name is Eli. You know what's fun about Boys in Action? You can learn about college and learn about cool stuff and everything. It's awesome in Boys in Action. That's it.
So thank you to Mr. Holloman and Mr. Scott for taking this on and leading our team. Thank you, as they said, to DEF and PTA for sponsoring the events that and the work that they do with the boys. And thank you to CSD and the board for supporting our work. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for moving us up in the agenda.
And I just wanted to tell Eli, Nasir, and Elliot that they did a phenomenal job. You guys are great
they
public
did.
speakers.
Comments?
Did you have any questions?
No questions, but it's great that they are meeting some wonderful mentors. I think that's fantastic. Thank you.
I'm just very impressed. It sounds like a very robust effort all around. So thanks for everything.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. This was incredible. Thank you for sharing it. And I did have a question for you, Amelia. Many times when there's a diversity discussion, racism is usually the topic of it. And I think sometimes racism throws people off because they're like, well, this doesn't really apply to me because I'm not racist. And so I appreciate the title being whiteness, because maybe some of the guards come down from the word racism and kind of bring people where they are. So how would you describe what that means in the context of the course that was given?
We learned about the fact that we as white people have traditions and a culture, and that because it's the dominant culture, it's not discussed. And so it's just a continuing conversation. And so we hope to continue working on this. And that was just the beginning of this conversation. We really did love having Pam Epps there, who is a psychologist. And that's one thing Dr. Beam and I have discussed a lot, is the fact that in some of this work, it can bring up trauma for some people, and it is nice having a licensed psychologist present when you are having some discussions where it can get real sticky. And so one thing that everyone kept saying is they really did want to continue having these conversations, but they really appreciate having those in small groups where they feel trust, that's really important. So we're trying to honor that and then continue in the work that we're doing and use that in our planning process.
Thanks. Thank you. I have one request for Dr. Ibukwe Hamilton. You mentioned that you're collecting information about and also creating programs that will feel more inclusive. And I wonder if when you, as you learn more about what those activities and events could be, if you could share that with us, I think that's something that all of the elementary schools could benefit from. And I'm interested in having a bigger conversation about how we will collaborate between now the different equity teams that we have at all the different schools to bring our lessons together. So, thank you.
We will definitely share, and I just want to also add that the other elementary schools have been very helpful. So many people, because our committee is new and I'm new to the area, so I didn't have the connections and I didn't know people. And so the other committees at the other schools have really reached out and been very helpful. And even people here, like Dr. Mary Banks, met with me and one of our other committee members before we really got started up to help. So we really appreciate that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's very important work. I do want to bridge to the DEF's Beyond Diversity training that's coming up February 6th and 7th, and encourage you all to go to the DEF's website, Decatur Education Foundation /equity, and you can sign up for that 2-day seminar there. And it gets into many of the things that Tasha was talking about and being able to create that space at the table where you can have the conversation and keep it going. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.
So, let's see, I guess we should circle back to chair comments or superintendent's comments.
I don't have any comments tonight. Let's keep it moving.
All right. I feel like I should, I mean, there's a few recognitions to, so I'm gonna try to zip through this, but first, we're proud to announce that DHS and Claremont were named Title I Distinguished Schools for 2019. This means that these two schools are in the highest performing 5% of Title I schools and Title I targeted assistance schools. I suppose that's within what, is that a nationwide thing? Or is it? That's a great honor. So
It is a great honor.
Congratulations on that. Decatur debaters, that is hard to say, broke some records this past weekend by placing in 2 tournaments. At the Gladiators debate at Johns High School, Kyan Sanavandi and Aaron Lamb, Kit Sanders, and Maddox Thomas were quarterfinalists in the varsity policy debate. And in the AUDL competition at Best Academy, Decatur won first. That was the team of J.J. Barber and Kaya Desai, and second, Ethan Joyce and Ben Sarasjan, I apologize for getting the names wrong, who tied for the first place sweepstakes. So again, this is a great honor and a big accomplishment. We're proud of our students. We wanted to recognize the FAVE, Voices of Fifth Avenue Choir, who performed at the Decatur Holiday Tree Lighting. A big congratulations to DHS student Alex Wagner, alumnus Happy Harold, and DHS teacher Jennifer Gonzalez, who last week were named 2019 Decatur Hometown Heroes by the Decatur Business Association. That's a particularly great honor, and I particularly like having our people out there in the community and being recognized for their service to Decatur. I know that there's at least one that we need to recognize, Mr. Truon, whose band was selected to perform at the, what is it, the Troy State?
Yeah, I don't know the name of it.
It's a great honor, and the band was selected based on a very competitive selection process. And so congratulations to the band. I thought that there was one more. Oh, I wanted to recognize Courtney and Sarah, who have put together, Sarah Jones, our communications folks, for the excellent work on the new, what is it called, the staff.
So there's two, the District Dispatch and the Staff Scoop are two new newsletters for us.
And so this came into my email the other day, and I thought, this is just a very informative, good, professional newsletter. I was really proud of it, so good work. Courtney didn't put that in here. All right. That's all I have for the superintendent's, or for the chair's comments. I think we now move to consent items. And we have three that are still on consent, which is the personnel report, the school nutrition report, and the financial report. Do we have a motion to approve those three consent items?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Chair votes aye, so the consent items 1, 2, and 3 pass, or are approved.
So development report on informational reports, I don't think we have any discussion, but we did ask to move it there in case we ever want discussion. Is there any discussion about that?
So we can, does anybody want to discuss the development report? Okay. We've already done the equity spotlight. This brings us to the enrollment projections report.
All right, so Heidi is going to walk us through the enrollment projections. If you looked at the agenda earlier, first thing this morning, it still had our draft reports, and since then we did receive final reports. And it looks to me like you have them at your table here, and we've also uploaded them to the board item for those who are interested in seeing it. And then Heidi also updated her presentation. So if you have the older materials, you'll want to look at these newer materials instead. Heidi?
Hey, good evening. How are y'all?
Good.
And so what I've tried to do with this summary is to summarize the two reports you have there. There's a lot of data and a lot of information. We have a projections report, which basically looks at the next 10 years and what students to expect, and then a yield analysis, which looks at our different neighborhoods and our different types of housing, and lets us know what kinds of, how many students per unit of housing that we have been seeing and hopefully can expect. So the big picture summary is, over the past 10 years, we've increased by almost 3,000 students based on survival methodology. Our enrollment is projected to increase slightly and then decrease over the next 10 years. And you can see that very top line, when we got the original reports, Dave and I really couldn't believe that we really weren't going to maintain, we couldn't see kindergarten dipping. So we kind of went back and forth with cooperative strategies on developing an alternative way to look at it. And so that alternative way kind of keeps our numbers pretty steady without a dip, which we kind of like, but probably the truth is somewhere between those lines. And those sort of look at all the different methodologies. What they did in the enrollment projection, they looked at a lot of different data, population in public and private schools, DeKalb County population estimates, school-age population, housing data, development, building permits, live birth data, survival ratios from our enrollment and our enrollment history. So there's a few different graphs. And what I think is interesting here is you can see when you look at the building permits, the types of multifamily is really increasing, single family is decreasing. So the kinds of new housing is changing a lot. The live birth count is going down, which is interesting. And as you can see, our historical enrollment has been going up and is kind of tapering off, looks to be tapering off.
So before you go on, Heidi, I'll just emphasize that whole piece about the kindergarten enrollment is because of that live birth count going down. So the way you traditionally do it demographically, you look at by live birth counts and then look 5 years later to see who's going to enroll in kindergarten, and that gives you a ratio. And we've known for quite some time here that that is not a very good predictor of kindergarten population, because a lot of people have their children outside of Decatur and then they move into Decatur before kindergarten. And so that's why we asked them to look at projections an alternative way that we feel will be much more realistic in terms of what that kindergarten population will look like. And once you have the kindergarten population fairly accurate, it all builds from there. So that's why you see a difference in the two methodologies. And it's something that has been a challenge for cooperative strategies all along, because we are very unique in that. We are so small, and most of the births happen outside of Decatur. So
what's the alternative method? Was I supposed
So
to?
the alternative method is looking at the trends in kindergarten population, and we've noticed that over time, we have been fairly stable in kindergarten enrollment. And so therefore, we used that as the baseline for kindergarten moving forward, because we kept predicting dips and the dips didn't come. And so the kindergarten has been pretty stable.
I know this would be too much, but why not ask the question? It seems like you could, like, you've got cooperative strategies who's got this they're collecting a lot of data about our system. Could they not have some kind of a model that would look at the housing stock, who's in the houses, and where they are in school? In other words, at some point we get saturated with kids, and the kids are moving through the system because they've moved in and they're not going to move out until they graduate. But it'd be interesting to know how many of the kids that are suitable. We've got a yield projection for how many. You understand?
Yeah, I do understand what you're saying, that at some point the sponge can only hold so much, right? And
by looking at how much it's holding today, you could kind of get a sense by where the empty houses are as to.
And I do think that will become realistic once we have been built out. And at this point, we're adding so much more residential space, whether it's in apartments or condos. We're not even close to that point yet where we'd reach some kind of a capacity.
And if you look at this slide, what they did for the alternative kindergarten was they averaged 4 years of kindergarten cohort to predict it. When you look at the moderate, they have a weighted average survival ratios. The low and high are based on statistical distribution, and then the recommended is based on sort of they're looking at all of this data and our history and making their recommendations. So what I've done in this presentation is try to put some things next to each other that I kind of wanted to see together. But so this was the recommended that they originally came up with, which was showing our kindergarten numbers kind of going down. And so that was where we asked for a different look. And so the alternative shows them kind of staying the same across, and then the survival ratio goes up. The problem with this one, though, is that certain classes end up changing quite a bit in size. And so I think at the end of the day, when we figure out how to exactly use it, we're going to have to split the difference a little bit and figure it out. So when you look at the total district together, basically the difference is the recommended shows us having a little bit of a dip, whereas the alternative kindergarten shows us staying about the same. And when you look at them together, I think the one on the bottom is, the one on the bottom is the alternative kindergarten one. You can see the numbers when you look across at kindergarten are higher than the top numbers, and then they kind of, they go up in that way. But when you get up into Decatur High School, the numbers are pretty different. And so I think that's where we have to sort of look and see, is that really going to hold true, or what are the actual numbers we have, and kind of look at both to figure out what to use. So I think we still have some work. We just got these this morning. We still have some work to do to figure out what do we think is really going to work. What I did
Before you go on, Heidi, the other thing I'd remind you is 10 years is a really long time to project. You're projecting about kids that aren't even a thought in their parents' mind yet, right? And so looking out 3 years, 5 years, that's a little bit more reasonable. 10 years, your margin of error gets considerably larger. So just keep that in mind as you're looking at projections also.
So what I did with this last slide was just look at the top line is what the recommended was. In parentheses is what the alternative kindergarten was. And I put it in red if there was a significant difference between the two numbers, and so what you could see is like kindergarten, I think those red numbers are probably what we can expect. But then when you look at like 12th grade at Decatur High School, you know, if you look at the 11th grade class and how many are currently there, you know, that's likely to be the number, you know, so I think it's probably we're gonna have to sort of figure out which number we feel like is gonna really work, based on how many kids we have and just the two numbers. But we do have, what is nice is a lot of the numbers, especially at K2 where we're worried about it, are very similar between both. Just kindergarten is very different, and then the totals are a little bit different. So that's the projections. And then the yield analysis, this is like just the one-side summary. And what they've done is looked over 3 years and looked at the number of students that are living at different types of apartments. And they actually, if you look at the report, they went into looking at every little sub-development that's in our development report. And they have a yield for those. But as you can see, that when you look at the bottom for the student yields, you can see the actual numbers of students, but then how many per unit of housing. And so what's interesting about this is when you look at the different types of housing, you see single-family housing have the highest yield, and then it goes down with different types. And so I think I was a little surprised when I first looked at this data, when I was looking at the development report, at how low the yield is for condominiums. Like, that's just an interesting.
Can I ask about that?
Thing.
Is
Yeah.
when were those condominiums built? Are those ones that have been here for a while, or are they?
Actually dig into the report and it lists all of them.
It lists all of them, so some of
Yeah.
them are newer and some of them are older.
And that's why I'm asking the question. I think we need to consider the fact that some of the ones that are more legacy condo buildings could have a different population than apartments that are being built and populated today.
Right, and I think we will continue to track this to kind
Right.
of see what it's looking like, but it gives us a good idea. I think the other thing that is a little bit eye-opening is every unit of housing doesn't have a kid in it.
Mhm.
And that's important for us to know in terms of as we're looking at stuff, how it's gonna play out.
And to your point, Heather, the lists of all the apartments, if someone could help us kind of categorize those, we could definitely make that one of the variables too.
Yeah,
You know.
because I'm thinking of when they were completed. You know, if they were completed 10 years ago, it could have attracted a different population than if they were completed today, and also depending on the location, so.
And on page 17 is where this chart is that she has up here in the yield analysis report, the thinner one. And just to remind you, those are the numbers that we've been needing for those spreadsheets we've talked about for a long time. We had some for apartments, but we didn't have them for all the others. We were just
Right.
guessing,
That's
right?
great. I'm
And so this
excited.
is really awesome to have the actual data. They geocoded all of our students, and they and Heidi put in a tremendous amount of work to get this figured out. Heidi was going through figuring out parcel by parcel what's happening. Like, the amount of work that went into this is unbelievable, but it is so helpful. So it's going to be really informative as we look at both internal projects and annexations in the future. It'll be very
Right.
helpful.
And so thank you, and you will be able to also look at it after our new construction comes online and see how close we were and make adjustments. I mean,
Correct.
that's gonna be very
Exactly.
interesting.
Yeah.
So,
Is the
thank
yield
you.
per apartment higher than we had thought?
Well, so what they did is they do it at, for all apartments, and remember, we had started looking at those that were 2 or more bedrooms. And it's 0.37 students per apartment, which if I had thought anecdotally in terms of how many, like, if we looked at all apartments, I would not have guessed that high. Like, that's higher than I would have expected. And then the other interesting thing on page 17 is the question that came up earlier, I can't remember from whom, but those are a bunch of planned projects, and using those ratios, how many students are you expecting? And so you can see where that's looking like. Amley Decatur, which I think is the one right down here, right?
Next to the high school.
122 potential students from that one development. So it's fascinating.
Yeah,
Where's Cortland?
yeah, it's so,
So Cortland is over on North Arcadia and,
Oh, that's the one that's half-built now.
yeah, it's partially complete.
And already has students there
34
Really?
kids, yeah.
as of right now.
It's plywood.
No, the Cortland Decatur East, isn't that the one that is where we were thinking of putting an ECLC?
Right.
Yeah. By the MARTA station.
Oh,
okay. by
oh,
Marta
that's not what I
Station.
was thinking.
Oh, I was thinking about the one by,
Where the Publix is going.
yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a different one.
Oh, okay. 137 students. Wow.
Do we have, this is incredible, and this is great work, and it's going to be very valuable and useful. Do we have the capacity with the geocoding to do this in-house, or is this a continued relationship with cooperative
We might
strategies?
at some point. We are working on that. It's actually one of the budget proposals is to put together a tool that would allow us to do a lot of this type of work in-house. But as of right now, we would need to use them.
It takes an incredible amount of effort for a lot of the details that people simply can't fathom how difficult it can be to get good data and good information. And the value to talking with the city and not shooting from the hip emotionally, but being able to present a factual, logical case, and to talk with our legislative representatives. When they throw things at us at the 11th hour, it's going to be very useful. So thank you for all the work that went into this.
I agree.
Yeah, thank you. And have we shared this with the city?
No,
It just came today, literally.
we got it this morning. I will share it with the folks that are, the committee that Noel and I sit on. And actually, you know, the fire department is really interested in these kind of
Yeah.
projections too, so that they can plan for, you know, knowing where the kids are, because that's a different kind of service that if they have to get kids out of a place and that kind of thing.
And I will be sharing those with Andrea.
Thank you. It's really exciting because our city has not seen this rate of multi-family density growth ever. So it's really a big change, and so it's nice to feel like we are ahead of the curve in terms of understanding and being able to predict the impact it will have on our schools.
I
Thank you.
also appreciate y'all adjusting the kindergarten enrollments, because it just has never, I mean, we might have 30 to 40% of the students show up who wouldn't be in those studies, although it does change from year to year. I'm not sure, can we go back to the 5th draft, which had, no, we don't need that.
What do you want?
Oh, could you perhaps discuss why we switched from, historically we've done, I can guess at the answer, 2-year cohort rate survival ratios to 3-year cohort survival ratios?
I mean, I think in large part because we had consecutive data to look at 3 years, because we've been doing that, and so just to kind of get a.
And I think this is cooperative strategies are the ones who have made that decision of what cohorts, and they don't look at a straight, if I am not mistaken, it's not a straight 3-year average, it's a weighted 3-year average.
Okay.
And so they want to see what that trend is without ignoring what has happened in the past. And so that's part of their methodology that they found creates accurate projections.
I know that the further you draw out that, if you went to a 5-year ratio, you could then miss the curve, basically.
It smooths when you do that
Right.
too much.
And so there's always so much of it's an art more in some ways, not just a science.
Correct.
And figuring out how to tune the numbers. And I really appreciate that you all have been very good for a very long time. And those 1% here and 1% there adds up to a lot over 10 years. And getting these numbers as accurate as possible has been very valuable.
Well, and the other thing that isn't always visible is when we share these with our principals, and they'll look at them in terms of their school, for instance, right? And so Heidi shared those
Right.
numbers, and the principals will say, yeah, right, that is not going to happen, right? Like,
Right.
I have been in this school for 15 years, and I guarantee that is not going to happen. You know, and so we get some of that firsthand knowledge that we then incorporate with the projections, with that, like, boots on the ground knowledge, and that's then when we start figuring out staffing, for instance, so that we can have the science behind it, but also the reality of what our people who work with these kids every single day know about them and their families and all those kind of things.
So do you think at any point, you know, for example, 137 students for Cortland Decatur, so do we think that that could potentially affect our borders?
Our boundaries, quite
I mean,
possibly,
thank you.
quite possibly, like our attendance zones and
Right.
things.
Because everybody in the department would have to go to the same school
Quite
essentially.
possibly.
And so then if we had to make some adjustments, it would essentially be.
And that is
right?
such a good segue into our next item.
Oh, is it? Oh, look
Because
at
we're going
there.
to talk about facilities master planning next. So that is exactly why we have to kick off facilities
Right.
master planning.
Okay.
So, yes.
Thank you,
Thank
Heidi.
you. Thank you, Heidi.
Thanks, Heidi.
All right, facilities planning.
Noel, you want to give us a quick overview of the facilities master planning, where we are with all that? Yeah. Thanks, Heidi.
I'm going to be fairly brief tonight because we're planning on, and you'll hear in part of this report, coming to you with a much more robust piece with cooperative strategies and our whole introduction for the board in January. So what I wanted to do is give you an update. We've engaged cooperative strategies to work with us in this process. I met with our advisory group. We've had 2 meetings so far, specifically focused on the facilities planning, and it was pretty unanimous that we felt as a group we needed to bring someone from outside in to give us the right support to get done what we wanted to get done. It's a pretty robust process as we've talked about before. The great part about using cooperative strategies is what you just saw. They are doing a phenomenal job with our projections, which is really going to drive one major portion of this process. They've also worked with me and my team to come up with the grade configuration part, which was really part of the last segment of the GeoBond facilities planning piece when we were talking about what to do with elementary. So they've got a lot of data and experience and historical knowledge with the school system to help us with that. So we're bringing them in. Thursday night we kick off with, our first meeting with the advisory group. We'll be doing a Skype meeting. Saves a little on airfare and time for sure. We'll be working to get that group ready as the steering committee for this process. We will then come back in January on the 14th at the board meeting to do basically the same thing with you guys. That'll be the Board of Education kickoff piece. A lot of information, a lot of educational components to that, and they will come in and work with me to give you that presentation. Meanwhile, while they're here, we're trying to do as much good use of their time as we can. We'll also be conducting focus groups with some of the groups that you all have identified and that we have identified to get selective input from and specific focused input from. On the 15th, we will have our kickoff first full community meeting, and that meeting will consist of they call it the Futures Conference, but really it's a meeting designed to educate the community about the process, educate the community about what is going on in this field, how this relates to facilities, and then gather input in a community-wide setting. We'll also concurrently be launching a survey that will stay out there for a little while. So this is kind of 2 really packed days of community input and time with you all and time with the superintendent. We move into February and we'll have another meeting with the advisory group to work with cooperative strategies. That will continue in another meeting in March. The idea being to begin to put together those options. And the idea is this work will focus around taking those projections, taking our current inventory and the state of our current inventory and its educational adequacy, and figuring out what kind of things we can bring to the board for options in the future. That will culminate with the second community meeting on March 26th, and that's where we will begin to put some ideas out there and say, okay, based on the feedback we've gotten, based on the input we've gotten, based on our data, based on our projections, et cetera, what do you think? Give us some feedback here and tell us what direction you feel as a community we need to head with this. Then we will go back in April and May and work again with the advisory group to develop a June 9th final report with those options for the Board of Education. One of the things I wanted to do tonight, just briefly, is kind of give you a visual or an idea, not a visual, but an idea of what this final report will be. And it's really 3 main parts. First part is going to be capital project options, and I think that's what the bulk of this piece of planning is going to be, with community input, with what we're doing with the advisory group, and that's really the piece that you're you're most familiar with and thinking about looking for. That will have things to address the facility's needs, whether those are additions, renovations, replacements, new construction, temporary classrooms, whatever those options can be to address our student population and actual building needs. The second part of the plan will contain a piece that my team and some of our district personnel will put together for deferred maintenance, HVAC upgrades, security upgrades, energy efficiency upgrades, things that are these scheduled pieces that we've looked at in all of our facilities and say, okay, we need a new air conditioner on the top of this elementary school. So we're going to put that into this plan. And that aligns a lot to what we've been doing and will continue to do with SPLOST dollars. The third part of this will be related to any of those additional community facility requests. We've had a lot of requests out there that aren't related to, hey, where are you going to put kids when we continue to grow through this, and how are you going to manage that? These are requests of, we might like to have this upgrade in the athletic facility, or we may not want to have an outdoor amphitheater for performances. Whatever those kind of requests are, that will be the third part of this report that comes back in. So the idea is that this report will really capture all of those facility pieces that we've been trying to say to groups, hey, we're going through this process. We really want to get that information to the board, but we want to do it in this nice package. So that's what you should expect for the June 19th final report.
One of the questions came up earlier today, and I think I answered it incorrectly. I think maybe it was Jana who had asked about focus groups happening during the day, and I had missed that part. And so could you talk a little bit about that, of like what are those focus groups, and what are the opportunities for people who can't come during a day to participate?
For the focus group work?
Yeah, like what are the focus groups?
So the focus groups are, I'll give you one example, would be the city facility folks. I think that's a great group for us to sit down with, because we can talk a lot about the city planning and that, and really focus in on, okay, how do our facility needs fit into that? Another focus group would be, we have had a number of athletic boosters come in and say, hey, we would like to put this up, or we would like to do that kind of project. That's another piece of that work. So the opportunity for scheduling over large periods of time is fairly limited, but our goal is to get representation from those groups that we've been engaging with, whether it's city groups, whether it's internal groups, teachers, administrators, or whether it's these external boosters and supporter groups. We'll have a group of SLT folks. We have not developed all of those yet to send out the invitations.
So is the idea the focus groups are focused, like they say,
focused,
right?
Yeah.
To a particular category of, like you said, city people or teachers or whatever, and the big input where just the concerned taxpayer who wants to be able to have input on it.
That's the
Futures
meeting.
Conference
Yes.
in the evening. Is that correct?
That's the evening
Okay.
meeting. And we're trying to plan that well after work, well after getting kids home and feeding them and such. I imagine we will probably start about 7 or 7:30. That's what we've done in the past. We've had great turnout, and we will also put up a sort of matching survey piece that will allow people to go online and do that.
And so for those of you who participated in the boundary setting process with Cooperative Strategies, you may remember at the DHS cafeteria, we had that big community meeting and lots of stuff set up around. I imagine that's probably what this would be
that'll look more like our meeting too, but it's a very similar process. It's very similar to what we did with the grade band piece as well.
So for a general, just a taxpayer interested party, will be 2 stakeholder type meetings plus the survey for their opportunities to provide input.
Yes.
Okay.
I hope that answered.
Yes.
And are we planning to do maybe a work session around this versus just a board member?
Yeah, it wouldn't be a bad idea, and we may want to play it by ear depending on, sometimes in these processes, it just becomes super clear, there are not that many options, right? You have to go this route, you don't have any other. And so I think maybe let's kind of see how it goes when we kick it off, and then we can decide if we want to dedicate a work session to it.
I did have, when you were going through the schedule,
Yes.
I mean, I see the June 9 date when your plan is to have a final recommendation, but there's at least one other point where you said that you might come to the board, I thought.
Yeah,
along
and
the way.
I think that's what we're trying to feel out. I think that it will be January or February before I really have a good feel for what that looks like. And behind the scenes, I've been talking with Cooperative Strategies about how do we best engage the board along the process, because there is going to be some work outside of that.
And we can certainly
It's more like a March kind of a.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we can certainly do updates.
I would say
along
March,
the way.
April is much more appropriate to engage the board at that point.
The big thing we had to figure out was when can Cooperative Strategies be here? Because that's
Yeah.
where the gist of your expense is bringing people here to run things. And so we could even make this a standing item on board meetings just to give you an update of where we are with things too, if we wanted to go that route.
I mean, it may be advantageous. I think the April 16th date is a Thursday off the top of my head, and that may be something that we can adjust to have them in for 2 days instead of 1 day. Fly in 1 day, come to the board meeting, come in the next day, do my advisory group meeting, and then they jump on a plane and go. So there's some flexibility in there.
I mean, and as much as it makes sense, we can attend the community meetings.
Absolutely.
And,
Yeah, absolutely.
And so.
And I hope you do.
Well, I plan to, but what I remember last time, I think I recall that sometimes what they came to the board to present was just a
Recall
repeat of what was at the community meeting. And so that's not really necessary if we could make a point to attend the community meeting.
Unless there's something else.
Unless there's something additional, because it would just be a repeat of.
Yep.
If it's duplicative, we could be flexible and go there.
That's a great point,
So-
and I think that might be an easy way for us to skip having to have extra meetings that are repeats. But just to be super clear, as we get into January, February, as we start going through this process, if you all feel like, hey, we need to schedule a work session, we've built in some time with these folks to be flexible with that, and I'm glad to work with that, and we can make some adjustments, especially on the advisory group meeting weeks. That's where we can kind of push things back and forth. I typically meet with that group on Thursdays, so that's why I've kind of scheduled those as Thursdays. But so we could either piggyback on a Thursday, or I can move it to a day that works for everybody here.
Yeah. And those work sessions sometimes tend to be more productive because there's more of a dialogue.
Absolutely.
As opposed to a presentation.
And I can always come in and do a work session with you
Yeah.
without them being there.
Sure.
And if we need to have some question follow-up, things like that, I can do that.
Or even your Skype idea as well.
Yeah,
if they're willing
they're
to do
very
that.
they're very
That's great.
flexible with
Have to
us.
fly in for that, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Who is the Operations Advisory Committee?
So this is the same group that sort of worked with me through the last, 4 years. To deal with things like sustainability projects, the solar stuff that we did over at Renfro. They also work with me to talk about facilities projects, things. They worked with us with the configuration piece, the grade configuration piece, and the elementary stuff. So it's just an advisory group that I've had together with operations. Pretty diverse. I've got some folks that are experts in the field. One of the folks that sits on it works at Emory, and it's in sustainability. We have some members of the Decatur Sustainability Board on the team. Have some architects and engineers on the team. So lots of folks that work in this industry so that I can pull from those resources and get some good stuff. And then just some parents.
Thanks, Noel.
I think Heather even was on there for a minute at one point. So, all right. Thank you, guys.
Did you kick her off?
Right.
She took another job or something. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have the 2 action items that we pulled from consent. So the first one is field trip. And I did invite the folks from DHS here, so I shared some questions with them ahead of time. Do you guys want to kind of jump in and hit on some of those questions that we shared earlier, and then we may have some more beyond that?
Absolutely. So we have a practice over the last several years of advertising international travel opportunities to students. The first trip of significance that we really started many, many years ago was our German exchange. In the intervening years, we've had trips to Costa Rica, Spain, France, Canada, Mexico, and recently a trip to Ecuador. When we advertise these opportunities to students that are international travel opportunities, often we work with the travel company to try to get one or more trips comped. Contrast that to the way that our close-up trip to Washington, D.C. operates, where essentially when we advertise that trip, we advertise that as we want to know who wants to go, and we'll do our very, very best to find money for students who cannot participate either at 100% or 50% of the cost of those trips. So we bring this trip before you, this trip to Canada, in the spirit of thinking about potentially how we want to handle these international opportunities that come up going forward. With this company and this trip, Mr. Sproul and Ms. Wells and I have worked with the company. Which company are we using for this one? Jump Street Travel, to think about ways that we can provide scholarship opportunities for students to participate in the trip. They have essentially said, if you can get to, this threshold, this number of students participating, we can do one free trip. And they've also said, we can work it so that students who are able to pay can pay more money. And then if X number of students are able to participate, we can get another trip. So essentially, we're looking at, for this trip, if we were to get 28 students to participate, being able to provide opportunities for, if 28 students who are able to pay 100% of the cost were able to participate, we would be able to get experiences for 2 students that were fully comped. And then, if we had other students who had needs that were not 100% needs, we could, adjust that and flex that accordingly. The way that the close-up trip typically works is there is a strong partnership between the DC trip and the Decatur Education Foundation. They do fundraising, absolutely, but a significant percentage of the cost that helps support kids who might not otherwise be able to take advantage of that opportunity does come through DEF. Dwayne, if you want to talk a little more about the DEF process there.
So, good evening again. With the DEF process, generally, the parents will contact me directly. So I'm really the only one that knows outside of DEF. And then I'll give Gil a number, and she will come back with yes. She never said no. So we did meet with Gil this year, me and Ms. Hatfield and a few other, about just funding in general, because of the amount is over $30,000 is what she provides for close-up. And yes, that money could be kind of divvied out in other ways. So I'll give you an example. We're talking about 2 comps, where it's close-up we have 86 kids going this year in February, and 24 to 26 are getting some kind of funding. When I say some kind, I mean 25%, 50%, or 75%, or up to 90%. For most that are going, are getting that 90%. So we can definitely look at how we use those funds. Like I said, we initially talked with her, I want to say September, October, about getting a lump sum for the high school versus close-up getting this amount of money. But she has also expressed that she does see the benefit in being able to send our kids to our nation's capital to have that experience. And in discussion with Ms. Hatfield after your email, Dr. Duty, earlier, it was kind of that we talked for about 20 minutes while I was driving back from a meeting, and it's the whole thing of how many kids. The most bang for the buck is always going to be with close-up because of the cost. But then, do we want to do these other things with other students? And that's kind of the struggle that's presented to us. And just getting general direction on how we want to do that. So there are funds and kids are going on trips. It's just not as many, if you look at the numbers, going on international trips as being supported by the close-up trip to DC. And that kind of skews a little bit.
And I think what this really gets to is the heart of the core purpose of our work at school and the opportunities that we want to be providing for students. And whether we should be advertising and coming up with opportunities for students that some students may not be able to participate in on the basis of their economic situation. Choice is choice. But what should we be investing our energy in as teachers, as administrators? I have traveled internationally with students numerous times. Because one of the things that we do as a district is administrators accompany these international trips. They're amazing experiences for the kids and the adults that attend. Dwayne's had those same experiences. Jeannie Johnson's gone on trips. Jessica Sturm has gone on trips. Dr. Cross has not yet had the privilege. But we also recognize that there are significant limitations to who can participate in those kinds of activities. And so if the core purpose in City Schools of Decatur is that we shouldn't be, that finances shouldn't be limiting student opportunities, then we need some guidance on how to proceed with requests like this, because Ms. Wells is in a place where she's really done a lot of work to try to provide some meaningful economic assistance for students who might not be able to afford this trip. But we also understand the flip side of that, which is well-intentioned work, well-intentioned hard work may still be, leading to these same kinds of persistent challenges of unequal access to programs that are ultimately being advertised inside the school.
So I'll jump in there, Wes, and share my perspective of the conversations that have happened with the board and around this table and at work sessions, and that is that let's use this trip as an example. If we feel that this trip is valuable enough to offer, right, and we feel that it is a great opportunity for students, then we want to figure out a way to fund it for any of the students who should be going, right? Who would be appropriate because of their level of French understanding, sure, or it would be a meaningful experience. And our first question we would want to be is, who should be going on this trip? If funding was not a boundary, who should go, okay? And the second question would be, and now how can we figure out how to pay for it? Right. So I appreciate the work with the travel company, for instance, to figure out that at least having one scholarship slot is more than a lot of school districts have done in the past, and more than sometimes we have done in the past. So I appreciate that. And I think what we want to do is take that to the next level, right? And not have those economics be a barrier. And so this is one of the reasons for that student fees, fines, and whatever charges, administrative regulation of collecting all of this kind of information. This is a perfect example of why that effort was started, was to understand, all right, we think there are, 50 kids a year who should be having this experience, and we only think 25 of them can actually afford it, and some of them need 25% support, some of them need 50% support, whatever, right? And so then that goes in as a request, like through the budget process we just did, for instance. And so we can look and see, can we fund that internally? Do we need to partner with the EF? Do we need to find some other options? So I think I speak for the board, and what I have heard is that's our philosophy of how we want to approach that and not let those finances be a barrier. Sure.
Yes, and I'll second that. We have had a lot of conversation about this in the past, because when we rewrote our policy manual, that was one of our goals was to pursue equity to the extent feasible. But what we got to was that we don't want to lower the bar. We don't want to take away fantastic opportunities for students, because as you said, international travel is something that's just completely opens up your mind and relates what you're learning, and especially if it's a foreign language, or you get to see a different culture, or if you get to connect Washington, D.C. with your American government class. I mean, that's what makes learning come to life. And so we're not saying we shouldn't do these trips because not everyone can go. That is exactly the opposite of what we're saying. We're just, so I really want to emphasize that we're not saying let's lower the bar. We're saying let's keep the bar high, and let's see how we can help be more thoughtful about how we choose the students and help them get there.
But I think I heard two different things.
Really?
I think I heard you say, if we're going to offer the students, we want cost not to be a barrier to participation.
That's what our policy says.
I think I heard you say that if cost is a barrier, but the experience is valuable enough, we want you to offer the experience, and we will offer as much assistance as we can. I think those are two different things. Can the trip happen if there's any student who would like to go, but for whom cost is a barrier?
I think and the way I've explained it to others is, until you have been told no by all of the available sources of funding, until you've put in a budget request and been told no, and until we've asked DEF and been told no, and until you've looked for the grants and been told no, at that point you have not done to the extent possible given an equitable allocation of resources. Now, once you've been told no on all of those things, you've probably been told no because there's a question of the value of whatever the thing is, right?
I was going to go to that next. But and they're, like, I would hate to see the close-up funds, frankly, spread around, because that's such a valuable. I mean, there's experiences and there's experiences, and that's a really dynamite experience that, like you said, you get a lot of bang for the buck. That's not a comment on this trip. It's a comment on close-up. And so one of the things is that you sort of belt tightening in terms of which of these experiences are we going to reach for?
It may be that, it may be.
Or an enriching.
Maybe
Let's
we
make
can
sure that
change-
if we're doing it, let's make sure that it is extra worthwhile.
Or maybe we can change the frequency with which it's happening, right? Is another opportunity of maybe we can't do something we'd like to do every year, but we could do it every other year or something like that and still hit kids. But I'll just remind you, I want to read policy 1.3 because it hits right on this. So we say, to the extent possible, given an equitable allocation of available resources, knowing a student's subgroup based on race, gender, or socioeconomic status will indicate nothing about how they are likely to achieve academically, how their behaviors will be managed, or what opportunities they will pursue within and beyond our school system. And to me, this is exactly what we're talking about, is that.
Could you
What are
also
they gonna
read the
pursue?
vision statement? Because I think that gets to it at the highest level.
So the vision statement says, we will build the foundation for all children to be their best, achieve their dreams, and make the world a better place.
The point I jumped to in the vision statement is their dreams. And so I'm actually somewhat in disagreement with the close-up, even though I value close-up. And I might want to mentor or lead my kids down a path to close-up over some other opportunity. I think it's important that this be the students' dreams and the students' goals and the students' objectives. And I'm very wary of funding that the grown-ups put down one path or another. I also want to say that, my questions are about shining light on the access to barriers and breaking it out on exactly what 1.3 does. But I have to set the context that if the end effect of the board is that teachers who are already going above and beyond the call of duty to organize these things and even make these things happen in the first place, if we're the straw that breaks the camel's back, then we're not supporting you well.
Well,
So-
that's the whole point of the collecting all of this information ahead of time, is so it doesn't become a burden of the person who's developing the opportunity.
Right,
They may
right.
not even know what kids are getting financial aid,
Well,
right? The whole concept is that they develop that, whatever that opportunity looks like, and they don't even have to think about this part at all.
So I guess the underlying thing I'm trying to get to is I don't want our work to become a burden on the people who are creating those opportunities. Our work needs to support making those opportunities equitably available to the fullest extent possible.
And just to be crystal clear, nor do we want it to be, well, then let's not do these things, right? And that is the danger in what can happen in these instances, which is why we want to make sure we know about these in enough time that we can do something to help.
So the
them.
questions are inform us so that we know where to look. And it's not, expect everything to turn on a dime and be solved tomorrow. But if we're aware of it, we can start to do the things that we need to do to be more supportive and make it more possible.
On the close-up, I take your point about close-up, and I really don't intend to make a comparison between any specific field trip and any other. But I do think that close-up is a particularly well-thought and intensely good experience. Not all of the field trips that are presented to us, I have that same opinion of. And so some tend to go more toward a vacation in a foreign country, and others are very clearly cultural and experiences. And there's just a grade, and we can see it. And there's some that I look at and I think, is this really worthwhile? And so I do think that if we start looking at funding these things fully, which I agree we need to, but we are going to have to think about the trips we're offering. I just think that that's a thing.
So, we don't actually have a board policy that requires this to come here. I'm not sure, it's just been tradition. So if you want to vote on this, you can. I don't think we really have to. I think that we're ready to start working on the putting more of a process in place, because at this point, you may remember this was one of Bruce's things, was looking over the field trips and evaluating them and things. And so I think we can revisit as an administrative team kind of how this process looks and where we can get involved in time to help support financially so that it doesn't even become an issue.
Right.
And that's something we'll look at.
Yeah, and I think it's a partnership, because we need your help to understand how many students want to go, and what is the need of the group of students that wants to go.
I'm glad you brought that up, because Dr. Huddleston and I had a conversation earlier today about this, and putting the need first as opposed to the idea first, right? Because our process in the past has often been, let's come up with the idea, and then once we get the idea approved by this body, right, then we go start looking at, okay, now which kids want to go, right? Because that's just the way our process has been. Perhaps we take a step back and say, okay, what are our student interests? What are our student needs? And then plan from there. And I think that in all of this, that's kind of distilling it down. That's a part of the essence of kind of what everybody is saying. Like, let's see what's going to provide maximum benefit to kids, what kids want to do most, and then put a process in place that respects the student voice and in that process.
Yeah, and in the meantime, I'll speak for myself. I don't want these opportunities to come to a screeching halt.
Exactly.
I want them to continue, but I think we need to continue to evolve in our process and see some significant change just in how we are able to quantify and qualify, the need and the desires of the students. But I want to go back to just saying that I think it's an excellent opportunity. I would ideally like for all kids who want to go to be able to go. I think we need to be mindful that we won't get anywhere immediately or in a day. So I want to encourage the work to continue, and I want to encourage the work that we're doing here together to get to this point where we have policies and procedures that enable and make it easier for teachers to do these great experiences. Because we've heard from students who have had experiences in other countries, and they come back energized and enthused. We've also heard of significant efforts by teachers to get students to go on these trips who haven't had the means, and what an amazing impact that has had on lives already. And I've seen those students and teachers out in the community fundraising for those needs. We're fortunate that we have DEF. I think we can be creative. I think we can be thoughtful about how we do this. Yep.
So Ms. Wells, thank you for organizing this. Really appreciate it. I'm still hurt that my daughter signed up for French because I was hoping to practice Spanish with her for the next 4 years, but I'm getting over it, so probably. So thank you for your work on this. I know it's a lot of work putting these together, so thank you.
Thank you.
And it's 9:00, so we still have a couple of meaty items to discuss. We should try to.
Let's move on.
Try to move on.
So we've got the Tally Street construction closeout. You have a printout. We couldn't put anything in the agenda at the time because Noel was still working with the construction folks, the Belford Beatty, but he did a great job and got that all closed up. And so do you want to just give us the big 15,000 foot level overview of that?
I'll go 30,000. But yeah,
okay, perfect.
Absolutely. As part of the project, we as customarily along the way, we'll be doing some things. This project timeline, as you guys remember, was very lockstep, and we were jumping over hurdles of rain and everything else. We also entered into an agreement with the city at the beginning of the project. Construction had begun to go back and do some improvements along Tally Street in exchange for them doing improvements along Columbia. We had the trees that came down in the process of the storm, and then there were just some various scope changes that we needed to address. So Balfour Beatty and I have worked diligently since getting the school open to go back and really put all of our paperwork together, get everything closed out, and get the project done. So what this ask is to basically do a cumulative change order with them for $127,500 to address the trees, to address the Tally Street streetscapes, which we had anticipated being somewhere in the neighborhood of $150,000, so we did pretty well there. We have also reduced a lot of the cost of the tree planting and things, so that's what this is about. It's just to close the project out, and the dollars will come from our budgeted contingency funds that we had within the 22.5 budget. So just to be very clear, this does not take us anywhere outside of the budget. We've done quite well. I was sharing with Dr. Dede this morning how well we've done on this project and not exceeding that budget and really staying way under it for this project.
And I know as a school district that hasn't had an opportunity to build a lot of buildings recently, I'll just share a little anecdote from having built a lot of buildings in another district not that recently. It is not easy to come in within the budget like that. And so that is tremendous work, especially with the tight timeline and the rain delays and all of those different things. To come in on time and on budget is really exceptional. So it's awesome work. So kudos to you and your team.
Appreciate that.
Thank you.
We're a bit spoiled because the district has a very good track record of coming in on, at, or near budget. After this is closed out, what are the final bits and how much remains of the 2016 GO bond?
So from the GO bond is exhausted, and we are using additional funding that we've gotten from DOE reimbursements to go beyond that. I don't have the exact figures right in front of me, but we've done really well fitting $83 million worth of stuff into the $75 million GO bond dollars. We have not had to use much of our contingency dollars. That's been great. We've been able to really budget conservatively and meet those budgets. So I think we've done a good job of fitting into there, but we have completely exhausted the GO bond. We still have some money in the bank, but we also still have some bills to pay. So,
and I would guess probably by maybe when we do the final reports at the end of this fiscal year, we'll be able to really wrap up the reporting of the GO bond, I would guess, and be able to really show folks, all right, here it is, right? All the pennies have been counted. This is where we ended up. I would guess somewhat in that
probably
timeline,
early spring would be a better guess. Only just and for everybody's knowledge here, we still have some things going on at Tally Street to finish up. So I wanna give it the true test, but I can get us real close to there before that if you want to see a report and go down that road. But it's been great. We have not had to use much outside of what we've gotten from the DOE, and that was not my expectation when we headed into this. And I will tell you, we've been able to pull some rabbits out of hats and work with some great vendors to make this happen. So,
thank you.
Yeah, it's great.
So
thank you guys.
this one we do need approval on.
So we have a motion to approve the change order, 127, isn't it, what is it actually?
$127,500.
Move to approve?
A second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Chair votes aye.
Thank you for the support.
Thank you.
All right, so discussion items for the monitoring reports. This is the item that we tabled from the last meeting, and it surrounds our attempt at jumping into the full policy governance mode, whole hog. We've talked a little bit about maybe we bit off a little more than we could chew. I shared with some of you at various points that it came to my attention that some of our administrators were having to spend 30 or 40 hours putting a report together. And we talked about how, is that really how we want folks using time, right? Or do we want them planning out all these things we want them to be doing? And so that's when we decided to kind of pause monitoring reports temporarily till we could have some more conversation. And so I think we just need to figure out maybe a little better how we ease into the monitoring. And I think one way we could do that is maybe figuring out what are the things we care about most? Like, what are the questions we really want answered, right? Because eventually the monitoring report touches on everything, right? Whether or not it's something you're really interested in or not, it hits every single thing in that policy manual. And maybe the way we can ramp into it a little more is come up with some key questions to answer. You know, how are students doing, or how are our, staff, what kind of staff are we attracting to our jobs, or things like that, things that have come up. And if you look at some of the questions you've asked over the months and years, maybe those kind of things are where we could start by focusing there. And then once we get our feet under us with the whole policy governance and moving that forward, we can start to ease into a more formal annual monitoring report cycle. But that would be my suggestion. But of course, we're open to whatever the board wants us, however you want us to approach it. But
I was also thinking that we already do a lot of good reporting on a regular basis throughout the year. So one early step could be, once we decide what our priorities are, let's take what we're already doing and see how it fits in. And that can at least give us a straw man to build on.
So one thing we could do to start with is we could make up a list of the typical reports, like the one you got tonight, the enrollment projections, for instance. And you always get the academic achievement reports and some of those kind of things. We could put together kind of a framework of things that are just a standard part of the school and things that we do. And see where there are holes maybe.
Right. I think that would be
and kind of
helpful.
plug those holes.
And we could see if the gaps match the priorities and then focus on those.
I mean, I'm comfortable with that, if that would be something you'd support, Louis.
Well, one concern that I have is that we do a lot of reporting and talking, but it's all kind of ad hoc about the topics that are top of mind, and it's not necessarily systematic. And for the policy governance framework to work, we've loaded it in there with things that we don't intend for us to be top of mind. We don't really intend to have to talk too much about it, but it's important that it be done. And it seems that for this to work, we have to have a systematic review just to make sure that the points are touched in what you're doing. And if we resort to kind of we're just going to do it all ad hoc, and we'll just ask the questions we're interested in.
No, that's not what I mean. Sorry, let me clarify. What I mean is let's brainstorm, let's spend some time, at a work session or something and brainstorm those ahead of time so we can put them into a schedule and make sure we're answering them on a regular basis, not just top of mind, what do I care about today?
I think that makes sense. I also think, though, that my preference would be to do that, but to have to cast a wider net, but to expect much less in terms of the report.
Okay.
So that it looks like what's happened in the past is that we've thrown out some vague phrasing, and y'all come back with 30 hours worth of detailed quantitative measures that are misinterpreting what we failed to communicate, and therefore, it was kind of a wrong path, and we don't need that, because that's a waste of everybody's time. But there is some level where we've said, have a plan. We need to make sure that there's a plan and that box has been checked, and so that there's some accountability. One of the biggest things that I think on the board where we slip is when we don't actually follow up. And it's so easy not to follow up. And this is the one opportunity to make sure that this stuff is getting followed up on. And so I think it's important to have a report, even if it just says we're doing it. I mean, that maybe that's not quite adequate.
Right.
But
I get what you're saying.
without all the quantitative stuff, that stuff doesn't speak to me as much as just an indication that, yes, this has been being done. This is how we're doing it. If you want to know more, ask us.
Well, and maybe not always with all the quantitative stuff, but the quantitative stuff where it's really needed.
It's often needed, but an awful lot of effort's gone into stuff that's not needed.
Okay.
And so I think that having this discussion about, okay, where do we want to get, dig down and where do we not?
Right.
Makes a ton of sense. I just don't want to skip the sort of routine check-in that, yes, that's been done. That's been done.
So, will there be a conversation about what is needed?
Yes. And that's what I'm picturing is, this helps, like hearing these thoughts, because what we can do is go through, one, look at those common reports we already do, make sure those are valuable still and meaningful, and we continue doing those. Two, figure out where those holes are. What are the questions you want to be able to answer about how we're implementing things or what's happening that aren't covered by those reports, right? And then 3, look at things where we have very specific policies. Like I can think of one that at some point it says something like have an equity action plan, right? And so make sure that we have on the calendar when you are going to hear about the status of the equity action plan, for instance. And so we can go through and we can go through the board policy and come up with kind of a proposed calendar of what that all looks like from using that approach for it, and bring that to you and see if there's things we've missed. Does that sound reasonable?
Yes. And a similar thing, there's the equity action plan, there's that one that we used to spend so much time talking about, what was it? There's some plan that the federal government.
The wellness plan?
The wellness plan, but just making sure that kind of thing doesn't fall through the cracks.
Correct.
Is the point.
So that we could definitely do that. If you're okay with that, we could try to bring it probably January, maybe February at this point. Let me double check. I'm just thinking with holidays. I don't want to overcommit, but
sure.
Okay.
You know, when we talk about the early attempts to get the baseline reports in place, it was inevitable that there would be a lack of clear communication on our part and misinterpretation of our lack of clear communication. It's almost like Cool Hand Luke. But I think as long as we keep working at it and we're making positive progress, it will eventually resolve itself. And so what seems like a really big problem in the inertia of getting over that first hump, I think will smooth out and become easier over time. So I think it's easy for me to say today, you know, keep on keeping on. It's going to get better.
I think it's also, I think it's valuable. I think the back and forth about what we actually
Right.
intended is.
Totally. Yeah.
And, you know, one of the points is you can do a 5-year strategic plan that you put on the shelf and look at once every 5 years, or we get to the point where we're annually revisiting what are our strategic priorities, how are we communicating those strategic priorities, where does the regular reporting need to be tweaked so that we can focus even more on achieving results and the strategic priorities. So, you know, if I had a magic wand, there would be some type of a dashboard that did the data reporting and just got updated, much like the development report.
The folks in the back are kind of laughing at you because our conversation Monday at Cabinet was exactly that, is that we are going to start leveraging one of our tools to track things like the equity action plan and the district improvement plan and the wellness plan and all those plans to make sure things are actually happening, because we have the same frustration you have, that there are times that it's so many different people with their little pieces that it's hard to keep track of, but we have tools to do that. And one of those tools it's called a portfolio, and it's a way to look at all those plans and just see, are we meeting our milestones that we set or not? And where are we not meeting them, and who is it that needs some push or some support or something different or whatever. So that's why there's some giggling going on back there. That's exactly the conversation we had.
We're on the same page.
Yes.
When we do things, and this goes into the follow-up aspect, there's the installing something, there's the what you plan to do, what you plan the budget to be, and then there's the what you actually got to do by the time you got around to doing it, because no plan survives, impact with reality. And then there's
Plan survives first contact.
and then there's what the actual budget was, and at a certain point, what we want to know is what's the effect size? Was it worth doing? Is there a way we could do it better? And I think that we failed to close that loop effectively in many ways. And I'm not trying to be negative, but I think that I don't think we really closed the loop on the dyslexia stuff. We don't know what the effect size of the Orton Gillingham training was. I hope it was good, good intentions, but are we really measuring what we planned, what we did, and how well it worked? If the monitoring reports can get to the point where stuff like the development report is just being plugged in there, or the enrollment data that comes out at different times of the year is just being plugged in there, and then we can have the conversation about, have we moved the needle? What do we need to do?
Exactly. Good.
So the plan is what we're going to discuss the schedule at the January meeting.
I'll shoot for
So-
January, maybe
so-
February, but I'll shoot for January. Yep.
Okay. All right, so our next item for discussion is Senior homestead exemption.
Yes, so senior homestead exemption, just a quick note, we did find some typos and things in the original report, so they have fixed those, and we put the updated version on here. And you may recall at the work session, we had some questions about that Tableau tool. They did find a couple errors in that. When we had asked them to go back and recalculate some stuff, they had missed 2 possible scenarios to recalculate, and those happened to be one of them that we latched onto. And so they have fixed that, and I checked it, and when you do, for instance, the 80-year-old, what was it, 80-year-old full exemption, $40,000 or whatever, you get 0 across the board, because that's an existing exemption. So it really is now showing the change in potential cost. And then I shared some of the questions. I can pull them up again if we need to, but some of the questions that we had talked about at our last meeting that we needed to discuss, as well as the I found the charge for the original committee that we had put together, just in case we wanted to use any aspects of that that charge as we go through and talk about what a committee might look like that needs to work on senior exemption stuff. So.
And so first, the first question is, are we clear? I think we are. We do want a committee.
Well, I don't know that that's clear. I guess we need to talk about, what would that look like? How would our approach be? What kind of communication are we doing? First of all, we've also talked with the city about collaborating with them. I mean, maybe this is not our committee. Maybe this is our joint decision with the city of how we approach this.
Certainly could be.
Yeah.
But we do agree that there should be a committee.
I don't know.
We don't know.
I mean, I don't know that we have talked about it at this phase. I mean, what is our next step? I thought that at this meeting, we were going to discuss a parameter about how much we felt it could cost.
I thought we left, for what it is worth, I thought we left the last meeting this with the presumption that we're going to have a committee, although that was a presumption that was never actually discussed.
Okay.
Which I was aware of. But that, and we said, if we're going to have a committee, so it's an if, but if we're going to have it, they've got to have a super clear charge. And so the way that we close the discussion is that we could talk about what that charge would be. We don't need to start there. We can say, should we have a committee? And, it's my thought that a committee is probably a good thing. If they have a charge, and I think that we should, before we charge anybody, I think we should set the fiscal impact that we're comfortable
Right,
with.
I agree with that.
And in my view, a committee would be left to think through the different configurations of a homestead exemption to come up with the committee thought was good, right?
But is the committee a joint committee with this? Are we having, I guess, our joint conversation with the city? Does that span this committee?
I'm very personally, although I think cooperation with the city is very important, and I understand that we've already talked about having a joint process. It's also our tax revenue, and so I kind of think it needs to be a committee of this board that involves the city, and that's my opinion. So we might have a different opinion, but that's what I think.
Makes sense.
What do you think?
Well, yeah, I guess that could, that we would have a charge, a specific charge, and then a committee working on our portion of it that then informs the joint conversation with the city of the findings. Yeah, that could make sense. And if so, what does that committee look like? Is it community members? Is it,
In the past, someone gave us the idea that we latched onto, and so I think it was first for the superintendent search, that maybe that we could identify groups that we think should be represented on such a committee, and then ask those groups to figure out who the representative should be, so that we're not naming people, but instead we're just naming interests or groups, and then let them figure out who to put forward.
yeah, and then how does that committee liaise with the board?
It's an important question.
Say that again, Anita.
Oh, how does that committee liaise with the board? How has that worked in the past? I mean, when you were talking about committees we've had, right? We've had
If
kind
we
of this,
require- it'll require the facilitation of central office staff for information, or, you know, facility to hold the meetings and those types of things. But it's going to be really important that we get the charge correct, because it's really easy for committees to go sideways. Spend a lot of time on things which aren't clearly, you know, the clearly stated intentions of the committee. And so I think we need to, I hope that we can get back to the impact cost as a group, and how we're going to prioritize how we want, because, you know, we've exceeded the anticipated impact cost, loss in revenue from taxpayer dollars. And so we need to better focus that where it will have more of the intended impacts. How we state that is a charge to the committee. You know, I know that I recently received the information you sent about, was it Forsyth? And some of the loopholes that they had experienced with these types of exemptions. And somebody also recently brought up to me the idea, can you limit the square footage of the house? So there are a couple of things that GSU hasn't necessarily, we haven't even run past them.
Well, and I don't want to start going down a rabbit hole either. I feel like we have specifically hired experts in the field to give us some guidance, give us a tool, and given us basically 3 variables. And so I'd like to keep it simple, focus the charge on what variation of these 3 variables best reflects our goals, which were to curb enrollment by allowing seniors to age in place. That being our goal, we have X dollars we are willing to spend, and we have been given guidance from the experts on that these 3 variables are the best way to legislate this kind of exemption. And we have a tool that shows us, based on what age and what exemption amount and what income requirements we place on it, how we could in different ways meet that goal. And so what variations of those best meet the desires of the community within the parameters that we set and the goals that we set out to accomplish.
And part of the questions we came up with, I pulled up from our November 12th meeting, was what are those goals? And we got into the talk about how much senior stability is the goal. All seniors? 90% of the seniors? Like, what can we define that? How much enrollment growth control is the goal, right? None of the senior homes turnover, less than 10% turnover. Like, what is the goal? I think if we're gonna charge others with working on it, those are good questions, I think. And then the one being, what's the budget impact we can live with? I think is a really important parameter if we charge a committee with doing this work. And then the last ones we had asked were, should there be a sunset, and if so, how long? Because it has come up that 5 years is too short to actually change people's behaviors, is what we've heard from some seniors. And so we had talked about that maybe being one of the questions for the committee. But I do think if we are going to charge a committee, we have to get pretty specific on some of those things so that they know what the parameters are that they're working in.
Right. And I mean, ultimately, the committee will give a recommendation on these things, and then it will be up to the board to discuss and decide. But, you know, if we hadn't had the sunset, we wouldn't even be having this conversation now, and we would be in a really difficult position. And even looking at the current projections, when you put in some of the recommended or suggested scenarios, you see that they increase significantly over just the 5 years. So personally, at this point, I'm thinking that we would need to consider having a sunset, because there is not a stable amount. The amount that we will have in the cost and the tax exemption in 2020 grows significantly over the 5 years to 2025, even when we use this tool. So it's a moving target, and we have a changing demographic, and we don't have very many years for which we can study this data. And so I still think it's young in terms of how much we can analyze the effect and the impact. and the cost.
In order to focus the conversation, can we find out where do people stand on the sunset?
I think it needs to have another sunset.
I agree.
Does anyone disagree?
No.
Okay, so we're working, our charge will include a 5-year sunset. And are we now all agreed, I understand that the charge needs to be worked out.
Can I ask a
Composition.
question about the sunset? Does it have to sunset in 5 years? Does 5 years have to be the number?
We could propose a longer sunset if we wanted. It's just whatever we propose.
Because I thought the comment from the one family at the last board meeting was that it wasn't enough time, 5 years. And so if we modify it, we're doing it in 5 years, still might not be enough time to, really assess. Maybe it sunsets in 7 years.
But in 5 years, we will have 10 years of data, so that's why.
But it's possible that we may change. Right now, it's
Change the
100%
parameters
at
will
65.
Yeah, that's true.
Age of 65, we
Yeah.
might change it to 70 and.
And I think, not to speak for them, but the way I understood their point was your data you get won't be fully accurate if people don't feel the sunset will still be there. It's not going to change their buying and selling behavior, I think was the point those folks were making. That 5 years is too short, even if it looks likely it will be renewed. You still, when you're making a decision about purchasing or selling and things like that, it might not change your behavior, I think was the point they were
Well,
trying
because
to make,
really,
so.
I think their point is really in like 3 years, right? That we're analyzing data from 3 years.
Yep.
And
Right.
Right.
even though the decision's gonna, we got to make a decision now about what happens, 2 years down.
Well, for what it's worth, my view of it is that 5 years is awfully short, and I'm not sure that people don't plan on 5-year horizons. However, as Heather said, there's still a whole lot of uncertainty. Now, if we have a limited, it would depend on the certainty with which we could limit the, one option that I haven't explored, but I intended to, was to see if there's a way to limit the total cost of the exemption so that we're actually guaranteed that the cost doesn't rise above 1.2 million, and you had a little bit of a float in terms of the dials. In other words,
Like, then would you retroactively prorate it for every taxpayer? I can't imagine
makes
how
no
that would
sense.
work. I understand, like, the money would run out, but then how would you allocate that over?
yeah, maybe it makes no sense. But so if you can't do it, then it just seems like we need a 5-year sunset because we've got risk that we've already discovered.
Can
And
I
I
put
think if
a,
we're basing it too on our projections, and that's typically what you were just talking about, looking at a 3 to 5 year and how things are going with our students, I think that matches up. And watching how our projections go, how our enrollment goes, I think that they should match. So 5 years, I think I think that's a good amount of time.
It is interesting too, when you think we set our millage rate every year, right? And a millage rate is a big variable for people as well.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think that's something to consider too.
I think people bake in an assumption that things are going to remain the same. And so even though it's not certain, I think it doesn't
Well,
create
and
as much.
I'll say this, in 5 years, the 65-year-olds will be 70,
Right.
and they'll get another 50,000 in tax exemption. So, there's
a good point.
that too, like, because what I understand is that the exemptions are stackable, and that, for example, if you had an exemption at 65, let's just say at $50,000, by the time you turn 70, it becomes $100,000. By the time you become 80, if you're under the income limitation, it becomes full. So with time, also as people age, their exemptions would be stacked.
can I put out 2 possible goals that we could discuss?
Right. Are we settled on the 5-year sunset?
Because I thought we were saying 5 years really isn't enough time, but
One person commented that, but.
I think if we're doing the senior homestead exemptions and the public perception is that we're actively trying to make Decatur more attractive for seniors to age in place, then I think those not seniors who are here now know that tweaking it so that it's, not going over and anticipated, so that it's not, the impact on the tax revenue is not too much, is not going to change the perception that Decatur is trying to be a place that helps their seniors age in place.
Particularly, for
people.
instance, if the message agreeing with you've been interrupting, I'm sorry.
No, David's point about people making decisions to move or not move, I think that's more about moving in than moving out.
I agree with that.
And I think if there were like some messaging that went with it, which is that it's our expectation that the budget impact is X, and yes, you can expect an adjustment at the 5-year interval if the impact is X plus whatever, but we're still gonna allocate 1 point whatever, you know,
Right.
we've got this much allocated for tax relief, and the adjustment might be in 5-year increments, but people will still have some assurance, as much as you can
That there'll
get. I
be
mean, it's a
some
different
type
board,
of-
but that we intend to continue it at that level.
Yeah. And I think if we stick with that number, it'll be easier to keep that promise.
So what is that number?
That's the next
5 years.
question.
Well,
Can I do the two
you,
goals?
you wanna do goals before the number?
Yeah,
All right.
because the number is about
Let 'em
how we
have it.
get to the
Let 'em
goal.
have it,
It's
Louis.
just a question, it's good.
Um,
Gigi have it.
The first one I'd say is from the senior side, is that we want the percentage of the senior population not to decline.
Well, now you're going into quantitative, so we're the same goals, two broadly stated goals, which is age in place, number 1, and number
Right,
2.
but I'm trying to put a number on it that
I
you can then
understand.
quantify.
All right.
And the other one,
Thinking percentage-wise or count-wise? When you say not to decline?
I would say percentage-wise, because that's more flexible in the sense that, you know, the demographics of the city and the proportion that are going to be kids in the school system, tax revenue, expenses, I think that just,
But how do we know if we have if we go over the percentage of seniors leaving Decatur, how do we know why they're leaving? Like, how do we know if they're leaving because they weren't
it's for the
getting enough?
committee to solve.
Well, can the,
Oh, that's a committee question.
Okay.
Which Garrett will be eligible to serve on.
Thank you,
Yes.
Garrett. Thank you, Garrett.
so do we need to,
I want to kind of go back, though, to the report and to our primary intent of the exemption, which is stated clearly here, and it says, "The primary intent of this exemption was to improve the balance between school enrollment and tax digest growth."
That was my next one.
that,
My
that
next
was,
one was
that
And
was-
then,
enrollments will
and then
not
it
grow.
says, providing tax relief to allow low-income seniors to age in place was a means by which CSD hoped to slow enrollment growth. So our goal, when you're focused on the schools, is balancing the enrollment and the tax digest growth, and we felt that providing the tax relief to the seniors was a means by which to do that.
I need to interrupt.
Yeah.
The authors wrote that, but the authors did not ask me what the intent of the, I don't know, did they interview other board members what the intent of the?
Did not.
I would say that came out of the discussions with Heather and Garrett and I think that
Okay.
conclusion statement.
But I'm making a point.
So you're differing
I
from
differ.
that? Okay.
And so I think that as I understood it, it was a dual goal, and they were both important. One is that we wanted seniors to age in place and to provide tax relief to seniors who are being pushed out, felt that they're pushed out. 2 was to stabilize enrollment, and that we did feel that it was a dual objective and that this would satisfy both. But I know that in my thinking of it, that it wasn't necessarily a one objective with the other, just merely in service of that objective.
Okay.
And that doesn't mean that that's what we are doing when we renew it, but just, I don't think that we can take anything from what's stated in the.
So, but I think that's where we get into the joint conversation with the city, because I think that like if we're talking about strategic planning and from our perspective as a whole, as a city, the conversation about seniors is a joint responsibility between the city and the schools, because it's one tax bill. And it's therefore a joint responsibility, because we both have an impact on the seniors. It's not one side's more responsible than the other or needs to provide all, the bulk necessarily or all the tax relief. That will be our joint
I
conversation.
don't think there's any argument there.
Okay. So, I mean, I do agree that as a city, collectively, that is important and has been discussed and has been a part of our strategic planning for the past 10 years, and it's likely going to be a big part of the conversation now as the strategic plan goes forward for the next 10 years. And I feel like we are a part of that. So the City Schools of Decatur is clearly a big part of the city's, the whole plan. And like I said, it all comes together as one bottom line on, what's the total on the tax, and it's our cumulative impact that will be felt by seniors.
I agree, but I agree. I guess my question though is if we're so my preference for this thing would be that we identify a number and then essentially loosely state the goals, which I would put as 2. And I'd point out that according to the report, we're not achieving either of them. And so it's really just a bit of money that we're making available. And at that point, probably the tax relief for seniors would loom larger in curbing enrollment since we've concluded we can't. And the main reason, in my opinion, to continue this is actually the tax relief side of it.
How did the board come up with the 1.2 number?
When we started this, when it was first proposed, I did some brilliant spreadsheet work and came up with the $750,000 or $750,000 at the time impact, which was based on the available data, which was scant. And before, I don't remember, something changed in the digest or something, but by the time we actually adopted a resolution, that budget impact was 1.2.
That's what we thought it was gonna be.
That's what we thought. So that was a projected impact. It wasn't in the beginning.
What was the beginning?
In 2016.
In the beginning, it was $750,000.
Okay.
And then before we went forward with it, we knew what we thought there was going to be higher, and we said 1.2, and we knew that we still didn't know, but nonetheless, that's how it came up. That's how it came up.
Well, and I just wanted to go back to what we were talking about. The report did conclude that so far, with the data that we have, they were not able to see any correlation in the buying or selling behavior of those that qualified for the exemption, nor did it alter the growth in enrollments in CSD. So you can ask, well, if we're not achieving our goals, then, what do we, how can we have a charge to achieve those goals if we're not believing that we're going to achieve them the way that we have been doing it so far? However, I did find it very interesting that in the end of the conclusion of the report, they did point out that they were unable to rule out, and it's an open question, it says, as to whether income limited age-based property tax exemption policy is likely to alter the path. So perhaps if we're focusing on the lower income, which they weren't able to disprove, that is potentially a situation where we could have an impact on seniors to be able to age in place where we might actually be able to make a difference.
So, right.
Just that was it was still an open question, and there wasn't enough data to examine that scenario. So do we believe that if we allocate funds for a tax exemption policy that targets the lower income seniors, do we believe that that could have an impact on curbing our enrollment growth by preventing those seniors from perhaps having to move out and sell their homes that then would get torn down and turned into, larger homes with more kids? That was still an open question. So I just want to point out that hadn't been completely ruled out.
Right. Going back to the
number.
What I would, just my concept of the thing is not to tie the hands of the committee too much in terms of those goals. And they're loose, they're generally stated, and honestly, I'm pretty, as far as I'm concerned, would be reasonably happy if we're comfortable with the fiscal impact to leave it to a committee of our constituents to say what makes sense. What's the right, if we're going to provide this amount of tax relief, what's the right way to go about it. And so let's get the right income limits. And I mean, it's gonna come back with income, you know, to turn those knobs, and what
Right.
do y'all think is the most fair, keeping these objectives in mind?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question to qualify that 1.2 million that we're referencing? That was in 2016. It's 2020.
I was gonna ask that too.
When we talk about adjusting that for the time, are we talking about growth in the digest, average growth in the digest? Or are we talking about CPI, inflation?
What if we did it based on either growth in the digest or a percentage of a mill? You know,
Growth in the digest would seem to keep it
Same thing.
proportionally locked.
right,
I would be happy with that.
yeah.
So if the magic number was 1.2 million, what proportion of a mill was that in 2016? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
And that would be then,
That would be
don't
the
do it in
number.
terms of dollars, do it
Do
in terms of a mill.
percentage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I want to point out that when I say the number, like if I were going to throw that number out, that would be the number in 2025, not in 2020.
Well, I think
Because-
the advantage of doing the mills is
Should be
then
the
it is,
same.
it adjusts automatically with the tax digest.
If it was 1 mil in 2016,
Right.
it'll still, that proportion will still be the same in 2020 and 2025.
Okay, so that would help
Should be.
protect us from what we're seeing, which is that the cost, well, no, the cost in dollars would still go up,
Right.
right? So,
I wonder if-
Proportionately, it would still remain the same because we'd be gaining more revenue because that would also go up. We'd lose the same amount of, proportionally the same amount of revenue from the digest.
right, but I'm thinking that a lot of our costs don't proportionally,
The digest doesn't grow with inflation either. It grows faster so far. It might actually go down too.
right? Right. I'm just thinking I'm trying to think about how that relates to our fixed costs or our operational costs, and like, would we be feeling more of an impact from it should that number
Should there be
in
some relief
dollars significantly increase as compared to our costs? Because like, we don't, I'm just,
Well, we're
I need
talking
help
5
thinking through that.
years, so
Yeah.
we could just define it in terms of dollars and recognize that dollars could have to change, but for the purposes of the committee, it's a little easier to think about it in terms of dollars, maybe.
Unless it confines the solution space. If they come
Yeah.
up with a solution space where the wording is mills,
Yeah.
now they can't use that.
So am I hearing correctly, I think that because we know from the report that we didn't really achieve the goals, but we're still having the conversation about the senior exemption because it's not just about those goals. It is about feeling like it's somewhat the right thing to do because we know the burden of taxes on seniors. And so maybe we don't even need the goals in the charge. Is that what I'm hearing correctly? That if we put the parameters on a 5-year sunset, not to exceed something in terms of mills or dollars, and an expectation that it's a shared responsibility with the city, that those alone are defining enough of a limitation that we don't even need to include the goals piece?
And
Is that
the
accurate?
goals being what? What were the
Well,
goals?
originally were allow seniors to age in
Okay.
place and control
Sure.
enrollment growth,
Okay.
basically.
I still feel like it's important to state them, and maybe we don't need to prioritize one over the other, but I think it's important because there wasn't the conclusion definitively based on the income limited, the population that had a limited income, and how that could still potentially be measured in the future. There just wasn't enough data, and there were data constraints right now. I still think it's important to say why it could be and should be important to the school system. Otherwise, I just don't even understand how it would relate. I still think that there's also a difference between, as Garrett was saying earlier, like attracting seniors versus retaining seniors, and that might impact how a committee thinks about where the funds should go.
That's an interesting point, because because the goals do change that conversation, because if your goal is to curb enrollment, and the complaint is that we need to prioritize aging in place over preventing people not being an attractant. If the goal is to curb enrollment, it doesn't matter. And
So let me just throw this out there. If the goal is to curb enrollment, the committee may find that the way you curb enrollment is by having the exemption apply to wealthy people, not poor people.
that's exactly right, too.
Right?
And we
so
thought
they-
about that at the time.
and so they could potentially say, only provide the exemption to people who make over $100,000 a year, or to whose homes are over $800,000 a year, because they don't have kids.
That's right.
You know what I mean? And they're moving in, whereas a low-income senior won't move in because they won't be able to afford to. So I do think we have to think that we may be surprised by what comes out of that, too.
We might. I mean, I guess I'd sort of, I think those are really important, because I do think you come to different conclusions. I also think that if we set this out to committee of our constituents, it's not going to come back like that. And
Yeah,
so,
good point.
And if it did, we could say, well, no, thank you, right?
I'm trying to back up and think at a higher level. And I think maybe the goal related to the seniors is that we don't want to force anybody out because the city and the schools are growing. We don't want to. And that's how I remove my cold blinders, by putting that in there. And then the big thing about the seniors versus enrollments and the tax digest is really, step back another 1,000 miles or whatever, we want to smooth out fluctuations in the housing market. We don't want to go through a 5-year boom followed by 13 years later, a 5-year bust. We want to do things that keep the distribution of the available affordable housing, the small houses, stable. I mean, it can change a little, change a lot. But what we don't want is to go through another 10 years of blockbuster growth or a huge dip in enrollments. So what we're trying to do is smooth things out. I don't know how you capture that. One thing that I think is missing is we're not charging the committee, at least at this point, with examining, I mean, basically we're in an arms race to be the most attractive place to be. And the incentives we give or don't give are going to be matched. They're not happening in a vacuum. So DeKalb and Atlanta and Cobb and all the surrounding places that can offer these types of exemptions, unless we figure out what they're doing and how we compare, and we continue to study that over time, we're just kind of throwing darts with blinders on. And we have to realize that if we up the ante, others are, and there's a cost to doing that. We overshot the mark, and others may follow us. And then if we don't get this in line quickly, we're all going to lose considerable tax revenue without achieving our objectives. And the last thing is, whatever we do, we need to leave enough of an incentive in there so that we're never caught unawares of how many seniors are actually in Decatur again. You know? So if we don't at least leave enough.
There's at least a little breadcrumb
There's
there.
got to be a big piece of pie, key lime, something good that's going to incentivize us to get 90+% of this. We don't ever want to find out there are twice as many seniors as we thought there were as homeowners.
And just also big picture, when I think about how much this is costing our school system right now, and I think about our priorities, and I think about one of our priorities being paying our teachers competitively, these go hand in hand.
Right.
And do we as a community value paying our teachers competitively compared to the metro and area, all the other school systems in the metro area? I mean, that has a lot to do with also maintaining everyone's home value and keeping Decatur an attractive place to live and own a property over time.
So ironically, I just happen to know that amount from our study last year because it was part of our budget discussions, and it's $1.3 million.
What is?
The amount
difference?
to be more competitive in our salaries.
Right, because we're not the most competitive
1.3 million per year.
right now. And, that to me is a core component of being and continuing to be an excellent school system. So, I feel like we have very serious stakes at, we must consider our exposure here, because that is something I would like to do better. I would like to pay our teachers better. And so,
We probably should have had the budget discussion before we had this discussion, because it might have impacted it.
It's true.
yeah, so, you know, so looking at what this is costing us, and that's why, you know, I want to be sure that when we come up with a number that we're looking out 5 years, because it increases. And I'm also comparing that to what our other priorities are as a community.
So maybe part of what we could do, because you don't necessarily have to have this decided tonight, right? So part of, I believe, our plan for our January work session was to be looking at budget type things. And one of the things that we're looking at is not just where you want to add things, but also where you want to change things, right? So maybe it would be more appropriate to have that discussion of what amount are we comfortable with as part of the overall discussion as we look at budget. Because like you said, every decision we make about dollars impacts other things, right?
That makes a lot of
And
sense.
so maybe we just make that part of that discussion at the January work session.
Yeah, I mean, that'll be a very hearty work session, but you're right, because we saw last year that we had to increase the millage rate, which increased everybody's taxes who was not exempt. So when we talk about, you know, affordable housing and housing being affordable, taxes are a big part of that. And we, you know, we have to be cognizant of, you know, however much we say we will exempt in the senior tax exemption means that everyone else will pay that much more. And so, again, we need to consider all groups and balance that. Because ideally, you know, wouldn't it be nice if no one had to pay taxes? But we all have a responsibility for shared services and community and things like it, having excellent schools and all, you know, the other city services that we all contribute to. You know, even, you know, you can look at federal level programs that we all contribute to. So it becomes a philosophical conversation there as well. But when we break it down and just look at our budgets, I think that's a great place to put this conversation, because it impacts how much we can increase teacher pay. It impacts how much we have to adjust our mill, and across the board, what programs we can support and not support.
I think that makes a lot of sense. This is not really directly responsive, but I think that in thinking about it, what I would suggest as goals, I think that would be my goals, I think I would frankly stop talking about curbing enrollment, since the report says it didn't work. And maybe there's more in there, maybe there's not. But the way I would look at this is that I do think that there's a philosophical justification for some tax relief. And people who have means, I think, do have some moral obligation to continue to pay. At the same time, you know, the idea that you have to continue to pay forever is sort of disheartening too. And it seems appropriate that at some point you get some relief. So I support that as a goal. And my goals would be, number one, ensure that school taxes are not the reason that seniors cannot age in place. And you know, notwithstanding the business about attracting seniors versus, it really is about not disrupting people and not making taxes the reason that they have to move, in my opinion. And the other would be to encourage age, racial, and income diversity indicator, which in fact is one of the goals of our system and of our school system, that we have to have a diverse community if we're going to raise the kind of kids we want. And tax policy is part of that. And I think it becomes a question of how much of our revenue are we willing, can we spare, is it appropriate to give over to that? And I think it's not zero.
And we need to make sure that that number is a number that we're comfortable with, so we don't raise the millage to cover it.
I mean, we're gonna raise the millage to cover it. I mean, you're right.
Well, I mean, we already did, but I'm saying.
Well, we're either gonna
moving
raise it or we're
forward.
not gonna lower it. But if we're spending the money, we don't have the money, which means someone's paying for it.
True.
Which was kind of contrary to our messaging last time.
Right.
But I just think we need to be clear about that.
Yeah, I agree.
Cool.
All right.
So maybe wait on figuring out exactly what a charge looks like till we get that dollar amount?
Sounds like we have to.
But I think overall, keeping it very specific and like going back to my point about not letting this become, like this isn't, we're not going back to square one. We've been given some pretty clear guidance, 3 variables that have a track record of being used in exemptions. They're understandable by the community, and they're something that we can also reasonably get through legislature as well. And they're under, I guess, you know, I wouldn't want this to go to a committee and then come back with like options that are so extreme or creative that they can't possibly be legislated, if you know what I mean. You know,
I have one caveat there,
Okay.
I always do, but the thing is that it's not, and I've actually asked the Georgia Municipal Association, Tom Gale, who's one of our parents and community members, has provided some information, but I asked the question, like, so what are all the options? Because I still don't know what they are. I told you I looked into the one, which is, can you favor people who've been here longer than other people? And the answer is no.
Right.
You can do things like, let's freeze, for tax purposes, the assessment. So you could enact a freeze that when you buy your property for school tax purposes, it doesn't increase, the assessment doesn't increase. You have to go at it through the back door in a different, you know, but there's a way to make that happen. But I really haven't looked, and it doesn't appear to be readily accessible, but you pointed out that in Forsyth County, they put in an exemption that says that if you get kids in the school system, you're gonna pay the school tax, which obviously makes a bit of sense. I didn't know you could do that, and I'm all for that, right?
Maybe the way to handle that is to say that at least one of the options that the committee presents has to use the parameters from the Tableau tool.
Well, that makes.
But that they could explore, they are encouraged to explore all feasible options.
I'd love to get someone actually tasked to in a committee is maybe the way to do it. But I'd love to have someone actually thinking through that and finding out what's possible. I keep asking the question, but it's not easy to answer. It's a problem.
What other counties are doing, whether states are doing things like that.
well, I said, or I think that information's out there about what other counties are doing. We can certainly look at that, but I think we did ask that question to Georgia State. We did ask them in our RFP. We did not dictate what the criteria were to be, and we asked for them to come to us with the suggestions. So, you know, we did solicit that input. Now, are there other like additional criteria we can add? Perhaps, or you know, but looking at what other people are doing is certainly.
I think it's clear that these are the 3 most commonly used levers that they looked at. There's no doubt that that's what they did, and I'm sure that they know that. But that's just because they're the most common. And so.
It's hard to study the uncommon things.
But they do exist. And so there are some out there. The Forsyth County exception is one that we ought to know about. We do now, but we wouldn't if you hadn't figured that out. And so I want to make sure that there's other things like that that we don't just miss.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think, I agree. I think we should definitely look and see what's going on around us to see that we are compatible with that and that we're within reason and thinking, you know, we don't have to reinvent the wheel if someone else has already thought of a different way or a better way. But
and they've been doing it for years. And
yeah, but we were open to that. I just wanted to make sure that it was clear that we did not specify. We did not provide limitations or say, we want you to tell us the answer to these, you know, specific variables. We didn't give them the variables. We asked them to give us the
What
variables.
caught my eye on that is that when the question, they addressed the question of favoring people who stay longer than others. And I didn't like their answer because they answered it saying, we don't think it'll achieve your policy goals. I thought, well, first off, you don't really know what my policy goals are. but number two, there's a stronger answer, which is you just can't do it. And so I felt like that maybe wasn't their strong suit,
Okay,
and that that's all.
it's possible.
I hope that we will continue to study the impact, while it might not be a goal for the committee, to study the impact on the relationship between senior move out and student move in.
Yeah.
Because I don't want us to completely remove that from the radar. We may not have achieved the objective, but let's see if over time, especially if we're able now, we know where every senior address that has a homestead exemption is.
You check it.
We have geocoded addresses for students. If we connect the two things together, we can measure senior move-outs and student move-ins.
That's true. We didn't have
And
that
senior
before.
move-ins.
Right.
So it's
and
now
senior
10
move-
o'clock. Should we move on?
Yes.
I think we only have one, well, we have to talk about future dates, so we have to talk about those. And we also have to talk about budget priorities, although did I just hear
I
that
can
we have
make
a
that really
January?
quick. Yeah, we have a January work session, so I'll just share with you, as you know, we did the initial requests that folks put in for budget. We call them budget improvement requests, which is where budget holders within the district can put in a request for additional funding for various things. And I have shared with most of you, if not all of you, that we really pushed hard this year to say, don't come back to us later and say, I wish we had asked for this. Like, take the time, really think it through, and if you come back in, September and say, hey, I need another teacher, or hey, I need all these supplies, the first question's gonna be, why didn't you put it into the budget improvement request process? Well, it worked, and we got over 100 requests that totaled to $8 million. And 7.7 million of those requests were recurring annually. So just to give you a feel, and that's because $7 million of them were personnel. So either giving increased salaries to people or hiring additional people or whatever. That does not include the personnel needed because of growth. So if we were to add teachers because you now have to have 2 kindergarten classes instead of 1, for instance, that's not what this is about. This is about needs like we see a mental health crisis amongst our students and we need to increase our counseling staff. It's not about having more students, it's about having students with more needs that aren't being served, that sort of thing. So just to give you a feel of the scope, we'll get into much more detail at the work session in January, but it is significant. There's a little piece of those probably shouldn't have gone through this process and will be handled through like SPLOST funds as facilities requests, some things like that. But for the most part, they're all very legitimate needs. And so we've gone through an initial process of evaluating them through a rubric that we developed, and we'll share those results in January, and then we can start deciding where they align with the board's priorities and not, so.
Does that have the January meeting set?
Yes, it is.
This is a work session, is that right?
Yes, it's on the calendar, January 28th.
7 p.m.
Yes.
I'd just say 17.
7 p.m.
7 p.m.
Does that process include what would you sunset? What?
It does, although I think there were only 2 proposals that included that. We encourage people to include it because that would make their proposal more viable if they could show what could be sunset as part of it. But we're also then going beyond that and trying to brainstorm because some of the proposals do lend themselves to sunsetting other things, so.
I'm anticipating that work session being very significant, considering that we just added this conversation to that, and I'm wondering if we should start earlier than 7.
We can.
How early does everyone feel comfortable meeting?
I can get there at 6
Okay.
That's fine.
or
with me.
6:30.
Does 6 work for you?
Sure.
Okay, let's say 6.
Can we change that to 6?
'Cause I'd rather finish earlier than later.
Agreed.
There's a possibility that I've got an issue. No, I'm good.
So what time are we thinking?
6?
6?
6?
We're waiting for Liz.
No, I'm good.
Okay, we're good. 6.
Are you good with that, Dave?
Yeah, I'll make that work.
Well,
There were a couple more things on future dates. Jana, you had emailed a couple things of potential topics. So if it's okay with you, I can work with Louis and Tasha, and we can figure out where those fit. Some of them will actually fit with that earlier conversation of when we report out.
Yes.
But I've got that list, and we'll make sure that we hit on those.
Thank you.
And then Heather, you had sent something about the NSBA conference. So, and I want to apologize, the future dates are all in the past, which Heather pointed out. We totally missed updating the future dates, so we decided that was just really, out there. But anyway, so the NSBA conference is April 4th to 6th in Chicago. So that's something we may want to talk about.
Did you say April 6th?
April 4th through 6th. The registration is discounted if you do it before January 10th. So I'm thinking maybe over email, we should figure out if it's something
4th through
we
6th.
want to
Oh, that's a
go,
Saturday.
because we could save a little bit of money.
I wondered, like, if we had,
Saturday, Sunday to Monday.
Saturday,
That's
Sunday, Monday?
actually- Yeah.
I wondered if we had used up our budget.
We
because of
have, I mean, we've used most of the budget,
Yeah.
but then again, we never really plan out that budget very carefully, because these things do come up and we figure it out as we go. So it is something that we could accommodate within the budget if the board desires to go there.
For my part on this, I've used up a little bit of my middle budget or my personal budget or whatever it is. In terms of the group trips, I thought that taking the 2 trips was a bit much this year, because we did Colorado plus Philadelphia.
Right.
And I also have missed, because we did those trips, which were very worthwhile, and I thoroughly enjoyed them, but we haven't had as much of our retreat time. And the retreat time is also valuable, a little bit more deliberate. And so I would think that we might pull back on that and instead do what we did previously and send folks who want to go, but not try to make it a board-wide thing. Send 2 people in the SBA or whatever, if that's what people want to do, and then plan retreat time.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind going to this conference just because I have not been to the NSBA yet, and it was something that you all had shared would
You
be
didn't go with us,
valuable.
that's right.
Yeah,
I haven't been to the NSBA one, so.
I mean, I thought it was real worthwhile.
If folks are going, I would be happy to go too.
I would like to go to that one.
I was interested.
Because I like,
in
because it's
going.
on the weekend, I won't have to ask for time off.
Yeah,
so.
that's good.
I really enjoyed my one day at the GSBA conference.
And
You
this is
know.
like that on steroids. I
Right,
think.
well, that's what Heather explained to me, and so I would be definitely interested in going.
So how about I send out an email just so you all have time to check with your family and stuff if you need to make plans to figure out, and then we can.
Yeah, and don't forget to include James.
Correct. Okay.
Okay.
What do you think
January
about?
6th, is that a work session?
What,
The one that you were talking about for the budget?
January 28th?
The budget one is January 28th.
No
Yeah,
worries.
you
I
don't
just said
have-
if there's
you
another
don't need
work
that
session
one.
between now and then,
Oh.
do we want to bring James in on that?
There is not another work session between
Right.
now and then. No. The next time we're together is at the January meeting, January 14th.
That's good. When are we doing our no, never mind, that's fine.
Getting tired, Louis?
He said, never mind.
All right, that's all I have on the agenda.
Okay.
Is that it?
That's it.
We adjourn?
All right.
So,
Ooh,
thanks, everybody.
thank you.
Thanks, Garrett.
Thank you.
Take some cake if there's still some down there.
Kids, yeah. You know,
Because I was
I'm not
thinking
going to
maybe that's gonna
Disneyland.
get crazy.
Tomorrow.